Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 551, Splitting the Academy. In one of the most magnificent white marble buildings in High Garden, there were gorgeous wool carpets, tall stone pillars with relief carvings, and brocades with black-bottomed red three-headed dragon emblems hanging on both sides. Under the steps of the hall, there were many men in simple clothes and various chains hanging on their bodies. The first few of them were grey-haired old men, wearing rings, scepters, and masks that symbolized their respective fields, and standing at the front of the team. They were doctors of the Citadel, representing that they had reached the forefront of the world in a certain field, and no one could match them. Behind them were some outstanding bachelors. Meeting the new king was an extremely important matter, so even the bachelors needed to be carefully selected, and there were too many assistant bachelors in the Citadel, so they were not qualified to attend. However, at this moment, they had been waiting here for an unknown period of time, so that their legs were a little numb and their brains were dizzy. But they looked at each other, but no one dared to complain, and no one dared to find a place to sit down and rest, because there were no other seats except the one in the middle, and there was a group of demons beside them. The roaring warriors of Dothraki were standing on the left and right of the hall. They were wearing animal skin armor, holding shining scimitars in their hands, and staring fiercely at the group of weak scholars in front of them. For the roaring warriors who killed people like crazy, killing this group of people might not be much more difficult than killing a chicken, so they could only continue to wait. At this time, dense footsteps suddenly came from the back of the white marble hall. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." At the same time, there were the sounds of guards and maids saluting, and the grey-robed scholars who were waiting in the hall suddenly became alert. "He's coming." They all knew that the legendary young dragon master was coming, and then they looked at each other again, and saw the tension in each other's eyes. Whether they lived or died, and what kind of fate they would fall on was in the thought of the other party. Creak, creak, then the two heavy oak doors at the back of the hall were pushed open by the Dothraki guards, and a handsome young man with elegant clothes and silver hair stepped in. He had a pair of lavender eyes like gemstones, long silver gold hair draped over his shoulders, and a shining three-headed dragon emblem on his chest. "Your Majesty." The densely packed maesters in the High Garden Hall shouted loudly and bowed slightly, including the doctors of the Citadel who led the way, and the masters of various fields did the same. "Welcome to High Garden." Viserys also nodded slightly, and sat down in his seat, speaking calmly. He made some simple polite remarks, but in fact, these maesters had already been frightened by the Dothraki's butcher knives, so Viserys didn't waste any words. He looked at the group of maesters in grey below, and suddenly thought of Dr. Marwyn, who was still a guest in Pentos. He once complained to Viserys that the Citadel was full of grey sheep. Indeed, compared with Dr. Marwyn's bull-like body, these maesters were indeed bleating little grey sheep. He was the best fighter among the maesters, and among the fighters, he was the most knowledgeable. According to Dr. Marwyn, after he got drunk, he once challenged all the old men in the room with a chair, because of a disagreement, and beat them into submission. Since then, he found the best way to discuss problems with this group of people. But in the end, Dr. Marwyn left the Citadel, because he had difficulty getting along with other colleagues, and began to wander around the world. Then Viserys spoke frankly to the group of trembling and frightened grey sheep and directly stated his purpose. "The Citadel will be split from now on, and your rules should also be changed." "What?" The king's words made all the scholars present change their faces. Viserys' words were unquestionable, and he did not give them any room for discussion. He directly issued an order, and the Citadel had to execute it immediately. He required that the Citadel be split into several colleges according to the specific functions from now on. The major subjects would become colleges, and the minor subjects would be incorporated into these colleges. They were established in several major cities in Westeros, and are currently tentatively set as Old Town, King's Landing, and White Harbor. White Harbor has not been recovered yet, so it can stay temporarily. When the Targaryen army recaptures the north one day, a new college will be built in White Harbor. The most important thing at the moment is King's Landing. Viserys plans to approve several places in King's Landing for the construction of new colleges. This matter has been put on the agenda for a long time, but he has not yet made a field visit and is not sure which place is more suitable for demolition and reconstruction to build a national higher education institution. The splitting of the citadel is definitely a grand event. This is not a method that Viserys came up with on a whim, but he had this idea a long time ago. As the highest level institution of learning in the Seven Kingdoms, the Citadel concentrates almost all the books from ancient times to the present. It would be a pity if it was burned down. Therefore, Viserys had thought about how to better solve the problem of the Citadel a long time ago. Splitting this behemoth is the best solution. At present, the result of Viserys and his Imperial Council is to temporarily separate medicine, military science, economics, literature, metallurgy, and astronomy to establish a separate academy. They are all relatively important subjects. Viserys even proposed to establish a new theology, in which magic and mysticism would be incorporated. The Theological Academy can concentrate the beliefs of the seven gods, the old gods, and the Roina, allowing more and more Ed God believers on the continent of Westeros to join, even including some religions that are not well known on the continent of Westeros. From now on, whether nobles or civilians, if they want to become monks or nuns, they need to go through several years of study and examinations. Without a certificate issued by the Iron Throne, they are not qualified to become monks of the church. If they dare to preach privately, they will be illegal monks and will be arrested and thrown into prison. The emergence of the seminary can help the country better solve religious problems, and the introduction of the Red God faith and more religions into Westeros can also divide and dilute the proportion of the Seven Gods faith, which is in line with Viserys' future plan. The proposal of theology was unanimously approved by the Royal Council. Then the king's personal advisor Tyrion Lannister proposed that a law school could be added to help the country get on the right track. Tyrion's proposal was very good, but it was rejected by Viserys after thinking for a while. Although the law is just some cumbersome provisions that seem insignificant, it is a big killer. Viserys does not want to use it unless it is absolutely necessary. Chapter 552 Iron Islands. After the classification of the colleges, the next step is to divide the regions they are assigned to. This is something that all parties may struggle with, but it was quickly passed at the Royal Conference. Among them, the Kingdom Military Academy, Medical School, Economics School and Theological School were established in King's Landing, and Raven Studies was incorporated into the Kingdom Military Academy and became a part of it. Literature, history, linguistics, etc. are combined into the Academy of Arts. They can compose beautiful poems and record the history of the past and present, such as how many steps there are in the city, and how much shit a certain doctor has done in his life, so they are more suitable to stay in the beautiful old town. Astronomy is an important subject in Westeros. It can predict seasonal changes and help people sow and harvest. Therefore, astronomy is independent of the Academy of Arts and established an astronomy school. The doctors of the two, that is, the future deans, have equal administrative levels and are on an equal footing. They can return to the old town together and divide the city equally. As for the last metallurgy, architecture and other subjects, they are swinging between Lannisport and White Harbor and were finally temporarily set in White Harbor. Viserys ordered the splitting of the citadel, and the submissive grey sheep naturally did not dare to resist, and even a few doctors showed joy on their faces. Because the citadel was split, they were lucky to become the deans of the college, and it is almost foreseeable that their power will be greatly expanded in the future, even no less than the current citadel Grand Master. Everyone has their own greedy things, power, money, beauty, fame, etc. His Majesty has made up his mind, and the order has been issued. No one dares to disobey, and they can only bite the bullet and agree. Because the tough Maesters have all died in Old Town, the remaining group who can survive until now are not so tough, and do not want to die. This group of Maesters and doctors in grey looked at each other. Some were happy, and their eyebrows could not hide their joy, while others were also full of worries. As for more people, they were mixed with joy and sorrow, and they were worried, not knowing what their future life would be like under such a drastic change. Your Majesty, Your Majesty. Then Viserys got up and left. The Maesters had no choice but to bow and accept such a fate. Watching the young silver-haired king go away, The war in the Reach was over, the south of the kingdom was pacified, and Viserys led the army to stay briefly in High Garden, and then set off to return to King's Landing. On the other side, the Westerlands, which had not been heard from for a long time, was burning with the fire. Before going to the expedition, a Baron had borrowed a fleet from the Admiral Geoffrey Bracken, and he sent out the survivors of the Iron Fleet, the last Ironborn in the world. Euron Greyjoy led the Iron Fleet and quietly returned to the Iron Islands without anyone noticing. Now, this place has become a no man's land under the attack of the White Walkers. The Ironborn even spent some time cleaning up the whites that still remained on the island, but the number of whites was still too many, and they alone could not kill all the remaining whites. After all, the threat of the White Walkers has not been lifted, and the area north of the neck is still covered in ice and snow. Euron had contact with Viserys on weekdays, so he had also heard the news that the White Walkers would eventually make a comeback. The power of the God of Cold did not dissipate in the north, but accumulated strength to wait for the next decisive battle between humans and the White Walkers. Therefore, Euron led the Ironborn to land in Pike City and climbed from the sea to Pike City along the cliffs that were almost impossible to climb with ropes. The Ironborn killed all the whites here and cleaned up this magnificent castle. Euron even found his fourth brother Aeron Greyjoy in a corner. However, at this moment, Aeron Greyjoy had become a monster with long hair, blue eyes, rotten flesh on his face, and even a hole, exposing rotten black gums. But to Euron's disappointment, he did not find his eldest brother Balon and his niece Asha in this castle. They didn't know whether they died in the War of the White Walker invasion and became a member of the Whites, or whether they were still alive in this world. However, Euron did not kill his fourth brother Aeron to give him a chance to rest in peace. Instead, he and several Ironborn captured him alive, tied him up with chains, and tied him up in the blood keep like a dog. Even if he screamed wildly and wanted to tear apart all the living people in front of him, it was useless. Because Euron claimed that he would never kill his relatives, he did not want to be a kinslayer like Stannis. Therefore, he could only ask Aeron to continue to live. After Euron cleaned up Pike City, he closed the gate of the castle and completely cut off the world of dead people outside to prevent them from wandering in again. It took a lot of effort to clean up the whites in the castle. Then Euron led the Ironborn to set off for the west. The Iron Islands have become a GD. If Euron wants to restore the Iron Islands to their previous appearance, there must be a sufficient population. And where is the closest and most densely populated place to the Iron Islands? Coupled with the order a Baron gave to Euron a long time ago, there is no doubt that the direction the Iron Fleet is heading is Lannisport, a large city with a very dense population in Westeros. The raid of the Iron Fleet was extremely successful, and Lannisport also remembered to eat, but not to fight. 5 years ago, when the Iron Islands rebelled, King Balon's third brother Victarion once led the Iron Fleet to raid Lannisport and burned the Lannister family's fleet. Since then, the Lannister family's navy has been in a slump. And now Lannisport still has no defense against enemies from the sea, and now their attention is all on the enemies outside the city. The Targaryen army is attacking the city, and there are dragons flying overhead, causing great losses to the Westerly army. Perhaps they did not expect that the Iron Islands have become a ghost den, and there is an Iron Fleet that suddenly appears behind them as if by magic. Boom boom boom, the trebuchets roared, and the flaming boulder smashed into Lannisport. The Iron Races who came by boat raided and burned all the ships and crossbows in the port again. Instantly, the airtight defense of Lannisport had loopholes. The eldest princess of the new dynasty, Rhaenys, rode the green dragon Regal, and flew in the sky, where the crossbows could not reach, overlooking the battlefield on the ground. The Targaryen army had entered the Westerlands for several months, but it had not yet captured Lannisport, mainly because the resistance of the Westerlands army was very tenacious. Almost every inch of land advanced by the Targaryen army required blood. Moreover, Lannisport was one of the most densely populated cities in Westeros, with a large number of garrisons and excellent weapons and equipment, so it was naturally difficult to conquer. However, at this moment, Rhaenys saw a change on the battlefield below. The Iron Fleet raided Lannisport from the sea, burned the retreat route of the Westerlands army and many crossbows deployed here, and there was a loophole in the air defense of Lannisport, and she was overjoyed. Regal, it's time for you to take action. Go down and burn them to death. Then a bronze dragon, much smaller than Valerian, roared and swooped down from the sky. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 553, Breaking the City. The Iron Fleet attacked Lannisport from the sea, tearing the city's defenses apart. Once there was a loophole in the airtight defense, an avalanche-like ending would follow. The walls of Lannisport were blown down by dragon flames, and the Targaryen army poured into the city. A Baron led the way with a spear in hand, his body covered in blood and his eyes were red with killing intent. Go to hell. A Lannister soldier lying on the ground pretending to be dead wanted to sneak attack and kill a Baron. Puff, but he was pierced through the chest by a spear by the red Viper, and blood gushed out like a fountain. He swallowed his last breath with unwillingness in his eyes. Everyone, dig 3 feet underground and search for me. Find that old dog Tywin. We must not let him run away. The Dawn General, covered in blood, roared angrily, his black eyes full of bloodshot. He had waited for this day for too long, and now that Tywin had finally been defeated, the dawn of victory was within reach. Roar. The surrounding Targaryen soldiers heard their commander's words and immediately responded in unison, drawing their swords to kill the Westerland soldiers who were still lingering on the ground. The Westerland army resisted very tenaciously in this battle, and the city was also loyal to the Lannister family, which made the Targaryen army pay a huge price. Tywin Lannister, as a famous commander in Westeros, was very experienced in using troops. He took every step carefully and did not give a Baron any chance, which once made a Baron helpless. However, there is no impenetrable wall in the world, and even the strongest fortress will have loopholes. A Baron finally seized Tywin's loophole and broke through the city. But this does not mean that Tywin lost to the other side in terms of ability. After all, Targaryen's army had dragons as assistants. He was able to defend the Westerland for several months, which was considered very tenacious, and even forced a Baron into a desperate situation. A few months ago, the Reach sent troops, the Targaryen army's retreat was cut off, and Crake Hall was lost again. Tywin personally led the army to sandwich the Targaryen army in the middle, and there was a risk of annihilation at any time. At that time, the Dragon Riders of King's Landing had not yet arrived. A Baron was quick-witted and adopted a strategy that Tywin had not expected. He led the army to go deep into the west and advance towards Casterly Rock. Casterly Rock is, just as its name means, literally, it is a castle standing on a huge rock. Its walls are tall and indestructible. Casterly Rock has never fallen in history. However, before a Baron set off, Tyrion told him a secret about Casterly Rock. When Tyrion was young, he often played with his brother Jaime in the Hall of Heroes in Casterly Rock. This is the cemetery of the Lannister family. Those who died heroically among the Lannister family and their close relatives may be buried here. The Hall of Heroes was built underground outside Casterly Rock, close to the sea. Tyrion remembered that every time the tide came, when he was a child, there would be thunderous sounds from the underground of the Hall of Heroes. At that time, his brother Jaime did not take it seriously, but Tyrion, who was simple, kind and thoughtful since childhood, always remembered it. Later, when Tyrion grew up to be 16 years old, he yearned for the outside world and asked his father to follow his uncles to visit the free trade cities when he was 16 years old. However, he was ruthlessly rejected by Duke Tywin, who believed that Tyrion's visit to the free trade cities on behalf of the Lannister family would bring shame to the family. Moreover, at that time, the Targaryen army had already established a foothold in the continent of Essos, built a new city, and threatened Pentos with a covetous eye. Tywin was worried that Tyrion would be caught by Viserys when he visited the free trade cities to threaten the Lannister family. He was not worried that Tyrion would die in the hands of Viserys, but if Tyrion really fell into the hands of the other party, Tywin would have to save him, because it was related to the honor of the family. Therefore, Tywin finally rejected Tyrion's request to travel around the world and sent him to clean and repair the sewers of Casterly Rock, because he thought it was difficult for a normal person to get in. Tyrion was just right, and what kind of person should do what kind of thing? And when Tyrion was humiliated by his father to clean and repair the sewers of Casterly Rock, he discovered that there was a secret passage in His Majesty the hero that connected to the sea and allowed a ship to pass through. That's why there was a sound of water underground at high tide, and from here, this secret passage can lead directly to the interior of Casterly Rock. He told this secret to Oberyn, and Oberyn led the army to break out of the desperate situation and break through in the direction of Casterly Rock. Then Oberyn went into battle in person, leading more than 20 good men from the sea along the secret passage that Tyrion mentioned to sneak into Casterly Rock. The Targaryen army suddenly appeared in Casterly Rock like a god, killing the Lannister army by surprise and seizing the gate of Casterly Rock in one fell swoop. Then, with the help of the outside forces, the Targaryen army poured in from the outside world and miraculously succeeded in capturing this magnificent city that had never been captured in history. Tywin Lannister, who was closely chasing the Targaryen army, could only sigh at the city again. He led his troops to attack Casterly Rock like event, but this time the host and the guest were reversed. The Targaryen army occupied Casterly Rock, and the Lannister army became the attackers. However, Casterly Rock was still the magnificent city, so the Lannister army could not capture it for a long time, and finally had to stop temporarily, surrounded Casterly Rock, and blocked all news in and out. Because of this, when all parts of the Seven Kingdoms were recuperating, the news from the Westerlands had not been heard for a long time. In the end, it was the spies of the Octopus Spider Varys who desperately scouted some intelligence, and then sent it back to King's Landing. The royal meeting of the Iron Throne learned about Oberyn's difficult situation at the moment. Then Viserys decided to send the eldest princess of the dynasty, Rhaenys Targaryen, and ordered her to ride the dragon Regal to rescue her uncle. The arrival of the dragon rescued Oberyn from the predicament. The Lannister army retreated from the outskirts of Casterly Rock, imitating Dorne's tactics against dragon riders, and abandoned some large cities and castles except Lannisport. In the following months, the dragons continued to burn the Westerlands, and the Lannister army moved to the deep mountains and old forests to fight guerrilla warfare with dragons, and struggled to resist the invaders of the Targaryen army, until finally the Targaryen army surrounded Lannisport, preparing to capture the largest and most densely populated city in the Westerlands, triggering a decisive battle on the battlefield in the Westerlands. Chapter 554, Capturing Tywin. Tywin. Where is Tywin Lannister? The Targaryen army captured Lannisport, but they still couldn't find the Duke of Tywin. Then Oberyn ordered a thorough investigation, digging deep into the ground to find the trace of Tywin. The Iron Fleet burned all the ships in Lannisport. The Targaryen army was pressing outside, and there were dragons flying in the sky. This time, even if Tywin had wings, he couldn't escape. However, hard work paid off in the end. Oberyn's guess was not wrong. A soldier of the Targaryen family found the Duke of Tywin in the cellar under an inconspicuous house in Lannisport. At this moment, the famous Duke of Tywin had long lived up to his former glory. His armor was covered with mud, his bright red cloak was tattered, and there was blood on his bald head, as if he had hit his head when he got into the cellar. And there were no loyal guards around him. He was alone hiding in the dark cellar, hoping to escape, but he was caught. The discovery of Tywin Lannister, the Duke of Casterly Rock, was definitely a big news, attracting countless people to watch. His existence caused great trouble to the Targaryen army, and it was natural that he would not have a good end if he fell into the hands of the enemy. Beat him. Beat this old dog to death. When Oberyn hurried over, Duke Tywin had been beaten black and blue. The dazzling ruby on his armor was also taken off. His cheek was covered with blood, and he even had some spit in his speech, because his teeth were knocked out by a strong soldier. Master. Prince Oberyn. Seeing the serious-looking Prince of Dawn striding over, the soldiers who were watching Duke Tywin rolling on the ground all saluted and made way. The soldiers who were still kicking Tywin didn't notice that their own army commander had rushed over. They were still enjoying humiliating the nobles who were high above them in the past. Oberyn was still wearing blood-stained armor. He hurried over without changing his armor after hearing the news, and he didn't even wipe the blood off his face. He walked hurriedly, and then he saw several soldiers beating Lord Tywin. Isn't the shit Lord Tywin poops made of gold? Why can't he poop gold after he poops? They confiscated Tywin's weapons, So even if he wanted to commit suicide, it would be impossible. Then they kicked Tywin Lannisters, but with their feet, kicking him to the ground, and laughing from time to time. Stop. When Oberyn arrived, his weather-beaten face was full of seriousness, and there was a touch of white hair on his forehead. Snap. Then he reached out, and grabbed the wrist of a soldier who was about to punch the captured Lord of Casterly Rock. Who dares? The soldier's wrist was grabbed, and he was furious. He thought someone was meddling in his business. However, when he turned around and saw Oberyn, it was as if a basin of ice water was poured on his head, and he was completely sober. My lord. However, Oberyn ignored him, and just loosened his wrist. The violent soldiers hurriedly got into the crowd. His eyes were still fixed on Tywin Lannister, who was lying on the ground in a miserable state. There was a broken golden lion emblem on his tattered red cloak. Oberyn had seen Tywin before, so he could confirm that the person in front of him was the real Tywin Lannister. Respected Duke Tywin. Then the Prince of Dawn nodded slightly, and a cold smile appeared on his weather-beaten face, which looked a little fake. The smile of the Red VIP made people shudder. The humiliated Duke Tywin on the ground was rescued by Oberyn, and he breathed a sigh of relief. He was a noble Lannister, and he had never thought that one day he would be bullied by a dog. After being pulled out of the cellar, Tywin suffered humiliation. All his weapons were confiscated. Even if he wanted to commit suicide, it was impossible. He could only allow himself to be humiliated and beaten to roll on the ground. However, despite the humiliation and resentment in his heart, Tywin still got up from the ground, wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, looked at Oberyn, suppressed his inner emotions, and then spoke as calmly as possible. Prince Oberyn. The old lion's hair on the top of his head was sparse and covered with blood. A pair of light green eyes looked at Oberyn, and his voice was low and hoarse. I fought, but lost. How do you want to punish me? He looked around again, and those were the faces of Targaryen soldiers. They were all looking at Tywin with hatred. Although he was surrounded by enemies, Tywin still had no fear on his face. He turned around and looked at Oberyn again. Let these people humiliate me for fun. Beat me to death. Even though the old lion was covered in blood and his teeth were broken, he still maintained the demeanor of a duke and spoke in an orderly manner. He did not refuse to give in or cry like a shrew. Oberyn still looked at Tywin with his eyes sharp. After hearing his convincing words, he sneered again and shook his head to deny it. No, I won't do that. He didn't have such a bad taste, and of course he wouldn't let the soldiers beat Tywin to death. Then Oberyn took 2 steps forward and came to Tywin's eyes, and then handed the spear stained with the blood of the Lannisters to the guard beside him. The guard quickly took Oberyn's weapon and stepped aside. Tywin stood there and watched Oberyn walk in front of him. Although he did not take a step back, his breathing was still a little quickened. He stared at the other person without saying a word, waiting for the other person's follow-up. The two looked at each other, and the air seemed to freeze. The soldiers around were all silent, not daring to disturb him. No. Then it was still Oberyn who broke the silence first. It would be too easy for you not to do that, Lord Tywin. His face was still smiling, but his dark eyes were a little more fierce. The enemy who killed his sister was right in front of him, and Oberyn could not suppress his impulse to take revenge. He had been struggling with whether to cut Tywin's throat with a dagger now. However, he finally restrained his killing intent and loosened his left hand that was tightly holding the dagger at his waist. Tywin also let out a long breath, feeling that the lining under the armor on his back was already wet. Just a moment ago, he thought he was dead. You will stand trial in public before hundreds of thousands of people in King's Landing, confess your crimes, and then die. From now on, your words will vanish into thin air, your family will be obliterated, but you will be nailed to the pillar of shame forever. Oberyn then spoke in a cold voice. Chapter 555, Punishing the 9 Clans. The decisive battle of the Westerly battlefield broke out in Lannisport, and the Targaryen army won with the help of the Iron Fleet and the Dragon, successfully conquered Lannisport, and captured the rebel leader Tywin Lannister alive. Duke Tywin has been ruling the Westerly relying on the absolute prestige he has established. However, one day he suddenly fell, and the remaining Westerly nobles naturally had no cohesion, and surrendered one after another. But Oberyn did not let the Lannister family go. The character of the Red VIP is to avenge a grudge, and repay it double. He interpreted the promise to Tywin to make the Lannister family disappear into ashes and let his name be nailed to the pillar of shame. The Lannister family has a good breeding ability. Their ancestor Cleverlan is said to have cheated Casterly Rock from the Casterly family for this reason. According to legend, Lan lived for 312 years and gave birth to 100 brave sons and 100 agile daughters, handsome boys and beautiful girls. Later, there were too many descendants of Lannister, and Casterly Rock could not accommodate everyone, so some branches began to leave Casterly Rock and move to nearby villages. Later, the village became a town, and then a city, and became today's Lannisport. That's why Lannisport was so tenacious when resisting the Targaryen army. However, now Oberyn has successfully captured Casterly Rock, the capital of the Westerlands, and Lannisport. Then, in order to retaliate against the tenacious resistance of the Westerlands and the hatred of his sister Elia Martell, he brazenly ordered the massacre of all the Lannisters in the city. Even if they were related, it would not work. Tywin Lannister was the center of the 9 clans. Oberyn wanted Tywin to see the Lannister family destroyed in his hands. At the beginning, Tywin was able to remain calm, but when more and more people were killed, Tywin's eyes gradually became bloodshot, and anger then turned into numbness. He watched his nephews, his second brother Kevin's eldest son Lancel Lannister and his mother Dona Swift, his third brother Tyget's son Tyrek Lannister, etc. were escorted to the execution ground one after another, and beheaded in front of Tywin. Respected Lord Tywin, it seems that your surname can only be inherited by the son you hate the most. Oberyn still had a fake smile on his face, but it made Tywin's emotions a little out of control, but he was just incompetent and furious. The Red Viper exposed his cruel methods at this moment. He was best at torturing people, repeatedly touching and testing them before their psychological endurance. It prevented them from going completely crazy, while stimulating them from time to time. Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, had been tortured by him to the point of mental confusion, but he was still not completely crazy, and had his own consciousness. The war in the west was over, and Oberyn's name was equated with the devil in this area, and it was even enough to make people cry when they heard the name. He exterminated all 9 clans of the Lannister family, and even in the later period, many golden-haired people in Lannisport were hunted down by Targaryen soldiers. He is a remnant of Lannister. Catch him. People with a little bit of golden hair in Lannisport did not dare to go out on the streets, but the ferocious soldiers even broke into the house to arrest the possible remnants of Lannister. Seeing that the situation was about to get out of control and turn into a massacre, even the news had been transmitted back to King's Landing. The Royal Council of the Iron Throne was shocked to hear the news and spoke out in time to stop it. Oberyn then stopped the army's behavior and did not let things continue to deteriorate. However, the surname Lannister has been swept away, and at least for a period of time, it will not appear publicly in the West, except for Tyrion Lannister, who was appointed as the king's personal advisor, and the former queen who was imprisoned in the Red Castle. But one of them will never leave King's Landing, and the other has long been driven away by the Lannister family themselves, and was even almost killed by his own father. Tyrion was subjected to malice from others in Casterly Rock, so naturally it was difficult for him to have much sympathy for his former relatives. In the dead of night, he might even drink a few cups and cry. This was the information provided by the octopus spider Varys. Tyrion's reaction after receiving this news, and the important ministers of the Royal Council were also under his surveillance. He called 5 or 6 women in a row in the brothel, had 6, drank, vomited, and cried. Then, as if nothing had happened, he attended the Royal Council as usual the next day, as if he was saying goodbye to his past life. And in the distant King's Landing, Oberyn's actions in Lannisport were reported back to King's Landing, and caused a great response. How many petitions have been received today? The Dothraki army has not returned yet, and Viserys has already returned to King's Landing on a dragon. Meagher's tower, in the King's study. At this moment, a handsome young man with long silver gold hair sat on a chair behind a desk, holding a petition full of names in his hand. He glanced at it briefly, then shook his head and said, "The third one." The Minister of Intelligence Varys, who was standing next to him, crossed his hands in his wide sleeves and shook his head. What Prince Oberyn did in Lannisport is really hard to describe. He touched the bottom line of all the nobles, so naturally he encountered a strong backlash. Although countless ancient and great families have been wiped out in this war, they dare not cause trouble for the Dothraki. The bold eunuch used very cautious words and shrugged his shoulders slightly, because he knew that in addition to the relationship between Viserys and the Prince of Dawn, they also had a very good personal friendship, and that the king himself was a monarch who was arbitrary in many issues, and it was natural that he would often protect his shortcomings. It was probably wishful thinking for these nobles in King's Landing to move to a Baron by complaining. Varys thought about these things, and then he saw Viserys once again crumpled up the third petition signed by the nobles into a ball of paper, and threw it into the Worcester basket beside him. Then he suddenly thought of something, and after thinking for a while, he spoke again. "Your Majesty, there is something I don't know whether I should say." Viserys raised his head slightly when he heard his words. "Say it, Egon." Varys crossed his hands on his sleeves, and a tangled expression appeared on his cheeks. There was a voice in his mind telling him that he should be loyal to his majesty, but at the same time there was another voice telling him that he must not reveal such a secret. These two voices fought each other in the bold eunuch's mind. But in the end, Varys shook his head, trying to throw out all the thoughts in his mind, and then took a deep breath and spoke. "After your partner Balerion burned down the Starry Sept, he angered a group of fanatical believers. These people took up hammers and sticks and tried to attack the Red Keep before you came back. They called themselves the Knights of the Holy Sword. Of course, they all died under the spears of the Unsullied, and my little bad is tracking down the remaining remnants. However, I received news that one of them named High Sparrow seems to have contacted Egon. Happy Mid-Autumn Festival. I worked overtime yesterday and will rest today. The second chapter will be made up later." Chapter 556 Prince Egon. Egon? The name Egon had not appeared in Viserys' ears for a long time. In fact, there are two Egons in this world. One is now called Egon Targaryen, and the other is called Jon Snow. Viserys went to visit another little Egon, under other names. King's Landing now gathers many people who originally had a very important influence on the direction of history, such as Theon, who nominally has more inheritance rights to the Iron Islands than Euron Greyjoy. The relationship between the Stark family boys is a bit complicated. As the eldest son of the Duke of Winterfell, Robb Stark naturally has a high status among the brothers. He loves his younger brother Brandon the most, and he also takes good care of his father's illegitimate son Jon Snow, but he looks down on his father's adopted son Theon, because he is not a real Stark. As an Iron race living in a wolf pack, Theon naturally dares not contradict Robb, but he looks down on Jon Snow a little, although he did not show it very obviously, because he thought that he would become the Lord of Pike in the future, and Robb would own Winterfell, and the two could be brothers, but Jon Snow had nothing as a bastard. Overall, Jon Snow gave Viserys a good impression. He was a dark-haired and shy boy who wanted to be recognized by his brothers and sisters, but was frequently alienated because of his identity. Viserys visited the boy, but did not take him away. The other Egon claimed to be the younger brother of Rhaenys, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Dawn Princess Elia Martell. He had come to King's Landing with the army a long time ago. He wanted to learn the strategy of commanding troops from his uncle, but Viserys did not take him with him. So Egon could only stay in King's Landing, and became a marginal person, unable to directly ascend the Iron Throne, and control the government like his sister Rhaenys. Dawn also seemed to support his sister Rhaenys and Queen Aeria Martell more, because in Dawn, daughters and sons have the same inheritance rights. Before the birth of Viserys' eldest daughter Diana, Viserys designated Daenerys as having a higher right of succession than Rhaenys and Egon, and after the birth of Princess Diana, Aegon's right of succession was even later. In addition, Aegon's life experience has always been a mystery. There is no means of blood recognition in this world, and silver hair and purple eyes are not a very rare bloodline in Essos. It is difficult to convince people with just empty words. Therefore, although Egon has the title of Prince Targaryen, he has always been a marginalized person. There are even some rumors of civet cat substituted prince circulating in the market, pointing out that Egon is actually a fake real dragon. However, Prince Egon Targaryen did not rest during his time in King's Landing. He received a good aristocratic education since he was a child. Therefore, although Egon was not very old, he also knew how to make friends with the local nobles in King's Landing and sympathized with the people. He took out his pocket money to buy a lot of food and distributed it to the starving people and was loved by many people. It was at this time that Egan met the sparrows who were preaching in the slums. They recognized Egan's philanthropic behavior and implicitly mentioned some bad things about his uncle. For example, Viserys was disrespectful to the 7 gods. He took the initiative to lead the religion of another continent to invade Westeros, and Viserys launched a war to destroy many people's homes, leaving them homeless and forced to come to King's Landing to beg for food. But they never mentioned that Viserys single-handedly stopped the Night King's footsteps. The soldiers of the human coalition, whether Robert, Stannis, Tywin Lannister, Eddard Stark, etc., and the Dothraki, they joined hands to repel the invasion of the White Walkers, so that the army of the dead did not cross the Green Fork River and drove them back to the north of the Neck. However, the sparrows believed that this was the credit of the 7 gods. It was the gods who listened to the voices of the believers and then fought back the White Walkers and blessed the poor people. These have nothing to do with the strong country, the 2 kings who led the army in person, and the countless soldiers who died on the battlefield. After hearing the thoughts instilled in him by these sparrows, although Egan was not very old, he instinctively heard a bad feeling. He found a random reason and left the flea kennel with his guards in a panic. He did not leave the Red Castle for several days, nor did he go to see these sparrows again. However, a few days later, Egan was surrounded by several sparrows. When he went out, the guards nervously protected him in the middle, but these sparrows claimed that they had no ill intentions, but there was just one person who wanted to meet Egan. And Egan didn't know what he was thinking in his mind at the time, so he followed these sparrows to see that person. This was a tall, thin grey-haired old man. When Egan arrived under the guidance of the sparrows, the old man who called himself the Big Sparrow had his back to them and was washing his coarse cloth clothes. Egan's guards could not help but put their hands on the hilts of their swords, ready for battle, because this was the most chaotic place in King's Landing, where thieves, robbers, prostitutes, etc. gathered. "Hello," Egan greeted carefully. Then he saw the old man who was washing clothes paused for a moment, raised his hand to wipe the sweat from his forehead, and then turned his head to look at Egan. "Dear guest, please find a place to sit down and rest, and wait for the old man to finish his work." Then he put down the clothes in his hands and threw them into the bucket to soak, then weighed the bucket and put it in a corner and wiped his hands with a towel. Egan nodded slightly when he heard his words, and then found a chair and sat down. Then when the old man finished his work, he straightened his hunched back and looked at Egan with a sharp look. "Welcome, heir to the Iron Throne." The High Sparrow's eyes were cold but full of love. His voice was not pleasant, but rather low and hoarse, but full of a sense of security. He called the silver-haired boy in front of him the heir to the Iron Throne, which made Egan's butt, which had just settled down, a little uneasy. "Excuse me, but I think my uncle prefers my sister more," Egan hurriedly explained. Viserys' love for Rhaenys was well known in the court. Everyone thought that Viserys had already designated Rhaenys as the heir, not to mention that there was now Princess Diana. There was no sign that Viserys was ready to designate Egan as the heir to the Iron Throne. Love is a taboo of responsibility. However, the grey-haired old man just shook his head after hearing Egan's words. The people pay tribute to the lords pay tribute to the king, and the king and queen must pay tribute to the 7 gods. According to the Bible of the 7 gods, your majesty, you are the heir to the Iron Throne, until you give birth to a prince. Prince Egan. The High Sparrow looked at Egan with his sharp eyes and then spoke. Chapter 557 East Factory West Factory. Since Egan met the High Sparrow, he was deeply impressed by his words, so he came to Flea Bottom every now and then to listen to his teachings. The High Sparrow had a lot of experience. He was a devout monk, and his real name had long been unknown. He claimed that he had traveled all over the country, and the thick calluses on his feet were enough to support his statement. The High Sparrow valued Egan very much. It was his mission to guide the heir to the Iron Throne to believe in religion, so the High Sparrow instilled a lot of ideas in Egan. He angrily denounced the current archbishops, claiming that they were fat pigs occupying the temple and should be punished by the 7 gods. He claimed that the church should once again organize the Poor People's Assembly and the Knights of the Holy Sword. The church has mastered violence, which can be used to maintain fairness and justice in the world. For example, the princes and nobles who violated the will of the 7 gods were punished, and the inheritance of the Iron Throne should be the only male under His Majesty the King. The High Sparrow has now influenced a large number of poor people at the bottom with his words and personal charm. They voluntarily united with the High Sparrow. They hid under the water of King's Landing, and had not been discovered by the nobles in the court. In fact, the appearance of the High Sparrow was both accidental and inevitable. Since 2 or 3 years ago, the traces of the wildlings began to appear frequently in the south of the wall. They secretly crossed the wall, and came to the south to burn, kill and loot. At that time, the embryonic form of chaos had begun to appear. Then the winter came, and hundreds of thousands of wildlings dragged their families to the south. They blew the horn of winter, and collapsed the wall. The war started from this time until the invasion of the White Walkers, the largest human migration in human history. Countless northerners were driven by cavalry, and abandoned their homes, and came to the south of the neck. These were one of the causes of the chaos later. After the human coalition forces worked together to repel the White Walkers, they split instantly, and started a civil war without stopping. It is precisely because of the continuous unrest in the past few years that the population of King's Landing has exploded. Countless people have poured into the city. They are hungry and cold, so they naturally need to seek spiritual comfort and divert conflicts. The High Sparrow appeared at this time. These chaotic conditions created the High Sparrow. If there is no High Sparrow, there will be other sparrows. There will always be someone who will stand up at this time to take over his position in history. If there are not so many refugees, even if the High Sparrow has a strong influence, it is impossible to stir up trouble. Egan was bewitched by treacherous people. The problem of the High Sparrow is the dereliction of duty of the Royal Council. Viserys came to this conclusion after listening to Varys' words. It must be said that he was busy setting fire to the city during this period, and did neglect the management of the government. As Lady Olenna advised, it is not much easier to rule the world than to conquer the world. Although he once ordered the church to forgive the debt of the Iron Throne, and took out 200,000 gold dragons to help the refugees in the city, the way of distributing relief funds is always a drop in the bucket. The best way is to solve the whereabouts of these refugees once and for all. This is the responsibility that the Iron Throne and the Council of the King should take on, and the solutions to the refugee problem are actually the same. Either start a war, recruit all these refugees into the army, and then throw them to die on the battlefield. Or find a place to send them away. Most of the refugees in King's Landing are now northerners who were originally relocated to the south. The remaining refugees who came to King's Landing due to war and other reasons have returned to their hometowns one after another after the war. Only the refugees in the north still have nowhere to go. However, the war in Westeros is almost over now, and only the last Vale is left. Littlefinger Petty Baelish promised Viserys in a recent communication that he would get rid of the nobles in the Vale as soon as possible, and the Vale is easy to defend and difficult to attack, and Viserys is willing to give Littlefinger some more time. If this way of war is not feasible, then the only thing left is to find a place for the refugees to settle down. After the Vale is unified, it must be put on the agenda to repair the causeway of the Neck, lead the army to recapture the north, and gradually clean up the remnants of the Legion of the Dead. These are the strategic focus of the country for some time to come, and in terms of development, the splitting of the city and the construction and enrollment of the college are also very important. After returning to King's Landing, he has personally inspected and temporarily finalized several places in King's Landing for the construction of the college. For King's Landing, where every inch of land is valuable, the demolition problem is indeed a considerable expense. No matter where it is demolished, a large amount of gold dragons will be required. Although millions of gold dragons have just been moved from Highgarden, from the perspective of saving, Viserys has temporarily decided that one of them is the Dragon Cave, which has a profound historical significance for the Targaryen family. This is the private asset of the royal family, and there is no need to spend money on demolition. Viserys is going to flatten the Dragon Cave and use it to build the Kingdom Military Academy, which is the largest scale of construction planned among the several major colleges. Because it needs to receive the largest number of students every year, military officers loyal to the Targaryen royal family have to study regularly in the college every year. Here they learn to read and write, learn the knowledge of war, the art of command, and in addition to the Bachelor of War Studies, they will also recruit some disabled soldiers and officers to join. Viserys thought about all these things in his heart, and then nodded slightly. The affairs of the church should not be underestimated. Bring the Archbishop and Egan to me later. I have something to discuss with them. And let the Ministry of Internal Affairs handle this matter. Varys, don't worry about it. The bald eunuch, who was always respectful, was slightly startled when he heard Viserys' words, and then quickly restrained his emotions and nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. Ramsay Snow is the intelligence organization brought by His Majesty the King from the other side of the sea. His functions are slightly conflicting with Varys' little birds, but they are not exactly the same. Simply put, Varys' intelligence forces are relatively more bright, while Ramsay's Ministry of Internal Affairs is more suitable for doing some murders and robberies, which are shameful. Varys monitors the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms and oversees city-states, and collects civilian intelligence, while the Ministry of Internal Affairs mainly targets the internal affairs, monitoring the officials in the court, and even Varys himself. From Viserys' point of view, this is equivalent to a East Factory and West Factory in Ice and Fire. They check and balance each other. Only when power comes from the king can it be guaranteed that power will not expand too disorderly and become too big to be removed. If Viserys handed this matter to Varys, it is likely that he would collect intelligence and report it before making plans. But Viserys handed it to Ramsay, which is a precursor to a massacre. His Majesty the King will not show mercy to these fanatical monks. Varys has almost foreseen that King's Landing will set off a bloody storm in the future. But this matter has nothing to do with him, so Varys will naturally not meddle in it. It's just that little Egan may be a little unlucky. If he is really found with evidence and implicated, he may not be able to escape trouble. Your Majesty. Varys then bowed slightly, then took his leave, and left Viserys' study. Not long after, the Archbishop of the Great Sept of Bela came hurriedly with the 7-star Bible in his hand. Sorry, the second chapter still needs to be made up. Chapter 558. In the Red Keep. Egan is now a little upset because of the news of the war in the Reach not long ago. The Dothraki and the Dawn Army defeated the enemy, captured several cities, defeated the Tyrell family in Highgarden, and then broke through Old Town. However, the trouble lies here. His uncle was recuperating in Highgarden and did not go to the battlefield in person. When his dragon broke through Old Town, it burned the Starry Sept with dragon flames, and the statues of the 7 gods collapsed. This incident caused an uproar in King's Landing, which is dominated by the belief in the 7 gods. Some people claimed that the dragon instructed by His Majesty the King did this, despising the gods. Some people refuted that the king did not appear on the battlefield at all, but his mount flew to Old Town to participate in the war, and committed a sin. If you have the ability, go and punish the dragon. Varys' little bird and Ramsay's Ministry of Internal Affairs did not interfere throughout the process, but just silently monitored the public opinion on this incident. Then 2 similar reports were obtained and presented to Viserys together. The Iron Throne and the Council of the King seemed to be using this incident to test the public's reaction to it, and the result was that the 7 gods' control over public opinion was indeed declining significantly. The 7 gods in action in the White Walker War and the Red God's prophecy in this war have successfully reduced people's faith in the 7 gods. The collapse of the Starry Temple is also a serious provocation, which can prove that the public's reaction to it is indeed declining, and the proportion of royal power in people's hearts is rising. Because the 7 gods did not save the world in the most dangerous time, but the mortals stood up and stopped the terrible enemy with their flesh and blood. However, although most people's faith in the gods began to waver, there was still a group of fanatical believers who were extremely dissatisfied with this. They organized and tried to attack the Red Keep, but were repelled by the Red Keep's guards, the Unsullied Legion. The Unsullied killed people without blinking an eye, loyally executed the orders of their masters, and naturally showed no mercy to these mobs. This group of people had no armor or weapons, so they couldn't even break through the formation of the Unsullied. Although they were powerful, they were like an ant trying to shake a tree. It was a completely one-sided massacre. The bodies of the mob piled up like a mountain, and the blood stained the steps of the Red Castle red. They were then dragged away and put on carts to be burned outside the city. They were cleaned up overnight, and there was not even a trace of blood. That night, Egan heard the news and rushed out of the Red Castle. He saw several familiar faces among the corpses. They were his former companions, the sparrows who led him. Egan's panic became more intense, and his face even turned slightly pale. The maid who was responsible for taking care of Egan in the Red Castle thought that the little prince was frightened by the bloody scene and had no idea what he had done. However, now that his uncle suddenly sent someone to find him, Egan's heartbeat suddenly accelerated. He instinctively knew that the matter had been exposed. Oops. The silver-haired boy suddenly felt that a disaster was about to happen. He followed the unsullied guards through the garden of the Red Keep and walked towards the Royal Council Hall. His mind went blank. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and he didn't even know which leg to take. It was too early for him to participate in the court conspiracy at his age. He didn't have the ability and skills to do so. If Egan had kept a low profile and kept his head down, he might have had a chance to survive, but if he showed his head, he would be suppressed. How could he be the opponent of these people who were born and raised in King's Landing, who have been in the court for many years, and are used to seeing lies? Then when the silver-haired boy walked into the Royal Council Hall, he saw the adults present, and his uncle sitting in the first seat, and finally couldn't help but lose control of his emotions. Before Viserys could ask the reason, Egan fell to his knees with a plop, and confessed everything with tears and snot. "Uncle, I was wrong." Including how the High Sparrow indoctrinated him and lured him into the trap with the title of heir to the Iron Throne. And Egan's words made all the important ministers of the Royal Council look at each other in bewilderment. There are not many people in the Royal Council now, and most of the seats are empty. Egan's biggest backer is his adoptive father, the Prime Minister John Connington, and the Minister of Finance Illyrio Mopatis. Now they are both on the other side of the narrow sea. And his backer in King's Landing, Minister of Intelligence Varys, has been influenced by Viserys' spirit and quietly turned his back. At the same time, it was this bold eunuch who betrayed Egan. Minister of War Cargo has not returned to King's Landing with his army. Minister of the Sea Geoffrey Bracken is in Gulltown, commanding the army to attack the Vale, and Minister of Justice Oberyn is escorting Tywin back to the west. The position of Grand Maester is vacant. Viserys is interested in Dr. Marwyn, who is now in Pentus, and hopes that he will serve as the dean of the seminary in the future. He has already sent a letter, but he still needs to seek his opinion. Therefore, the only important officials sitting in the Royal Council Hall now are the King's personal advisor Tyrion Lannister, the Minister of Intelligence Varys, the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs Ramsay Snow, and the Archbishop of the Great Sept of Bela, the female knight of the King's Goodmire. Ramsay has made great contributions to the Targaryen family, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs is extremely powerful, so he is also qualified to attend the Royal Council. But the little skinning will not appear here on weekdays. Now it happens that Viserys needs to investigate the incident of the High Sparrow and find him here. The Archbishop sitting opposite him is also for this reason. The silver-haired boy knelt down in front of his uncle and cried bitterly, telling how he was deceived by the High Sparrow, and several important officials in the council looked at each other, but their expressions were different. The female knight Myra and the King's personal advisor Tyrion both looked reluctant. The Minister of Intelligence Varys bowed his head and remained silent. The little skinning Ramsay's cheeks hidden under the hood were gloomy, revealing a sneer, and the Archbishop was the most angry, even indignant. He denounced the High Sparrow for inciting believers to attack the Red Keep and deceive the prince, and immediately expressed the hope that the king would send troops to suppress the mob, and refused to recognize that they were believers of the seven gods. The performance in the Royal Council Hall was comparable to the Oscars. Viserys helped up his nephew who was kneeling and crying in front of him, and the silent Minister of Intelligence Varys finally coughed lightly at this time, then looked at Egan with a complicated expression and said, "Your Highness Egan, in view of your piety and the belief of the gods, and to prevent you from believing in the deception of the treacherous again, the Archbishop wants to personally accept you as a disciple, and teach you the teachings of the seven gods. I wonder what your Highness thinks?" Varys said, and the somewhat fat Archbishop sitting next to him nodded slightly, looking at Egan with a look of satisfaction. A pure Targaryen royal child is willing to abandon his surname and join the church devoutly. What an honor it is. and with the joining of His Highness Egan, who dares to say that the king does not value the church, despise the gods as a mortal? Egan, who was helped up, was suddenly confused when he heard Varys' words. Chapter 559, Anti-Gang Operation. The outside world naturally had no way of knowing about the conspiracy in the palace. After Viserys entered the Red Keep, he completely replaced the personnel there. All the guards of the Red Keep were replaced by more loyal unsullied, and the wet nurses and maids were replaced by old servants from Andlesburg and the Nine Towers Palace on the other side of the narrow sea. Sophia, the old maid who had served several kings of the Targaryen family and was once the personal maid of Viserys' mother, also returned to the Red Keep to help Queen Arianne take care of the little Princess Diana. Therefore, the Red Keep today is not as shabby as it was during Robert's time. Whatever was discussed in the court meeting in the morning, even the peddlers and hawkers in King's Landing knew it in the afternoon. The people in the streets did not know what was going on, but the people living in King's Landing had long been accustomed to the turbulent changes of political intrigues. Prince Egan, the son of the king's brother Aegon Targaryen, suddenly announced that he had joined the church and became a disciple of the archbishop. He gave up his surname and devoted himself to serving the seven gods and became the most core personnel of the church in one step. On the other side, the gold-robed members of the city guard and a group of mysterious men in black began to move out in large numbers. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Don't let them get away. They accurately positioned themselves, smashed the doors of houses one by one, and arrested the sparrows who had participated in the attack on the Red Castle. They were killed for defying the royal power that night, but they fled back home in a panic, thinking that they could escape, but they didn't expect that they had been targeted long ago, and instead brought disaster back, and implicated their families. Bang! The spies of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the soldiers of the city guard suddenly broke into the house. Although these sparrows fought back, it was useless. How could these poor people who were encouraged to pick up sticks beat the fully armed soldiers and the skilled spies of the Ministry of Internal Affairs? You damn heretics. An old sparrow with grey hair trembled with anger when he saw the soldiers breaking into his house. He didn't remember what role he played in the turmoil in King's Landing at all. They smashed the shops that supported the king and burned down a brothel. 2 poor girls did not escape and died in the sea of fire. Then the grey-haired old sparrow picked up a kitchen knife and rushed towards the spy of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. HMPH. Old man, you are courting death. The spy of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, wearing black clothes and a mask, narrowed his eyes slightly. His eyes were cold. He had seen many brave and strong mobs, but none of these mobs who were caught in the prison of the Ministry of Internal Affairs could survive Lord Ramsay's methods. They would rather die than walk out alive. Kill him. The captain of the spy of the Ministry of Internal Affairs ordered decisively. The next second, the spies behind him raised their crossbows and aimed at the old sparrow who rushed over, and the bowstrings suddenly burst out with a sound. Puff puff puff. Several sharp crossbow arrows pierced his chest, nailing the sparrow to the wall, and blood gushed out instantly. The old sparrow and coarse cloth widened his eyes. He didn't expect that the group of black-clad men would kill so decisively, and even killed a person without blinking an eye. However, he didn't know that this was the greatest gift from the other party. Otherwise, the result of being caught and thrown into the prison of the Ministry of Internal Affairs would be worse than death. Father. On the other side, the old sparrow's son was shocked and angry when he saw his father was shot. He rushed over and wanted to fight with these people. However, facing the fully armed golden robes, they didn't even have the qualifications to fight. His fist hit the armor without moving, but scratched and cut his palm. Then, under the other party's cold eyes, he was pierced through the chest with a spear and fell in a pool of blood. Your Majesty has an order. Your Majesty has an order. Arrest all the rioters. The soldiers of the capital garrison, wearing bright armor and holding blood-stained spears, shouted angrily with murderous intent. Dare to stop me, die. The gold robes have been completely transformed under the training of the Unsullied and are completely different from the corrupt and incompetent army. The remnants of the army have long been cleared out, or they could not stand the cruel training and were forced to run away. Now the people who stayed and the newly recruited soldiers formed a capital garrison with strict military discipline and high combat effectiveness. My son, you heretics will definitely be punished by the gods. The old sparrow widened his eyes and watched his son and daughter-in-law die tragically in the hands of the other party. Blood gushed out of his mouth and he cursed angrily. He didn't know if he regretted it in his heart. His son and daughter-in-law had advised him to stay away from those big sparrows, but he stubbornly challenged the secular kingship for the invisible and intangible gods. In the end, the gods he believed in did not stand up to protect him. Instead, the soldiers' sharp spears pierced their chests, and the blood that gushed out blocked their trachea, implicated their sons and daughters-in-law, and then the old sparrow swallowed his last breath unwillingly. However, such a scene was also being played out in other places in King's Landing at the same time. Capital Garrison. Open the door. Bang. The people inside were so terrified that they dared not open the door, and then the soldiers kicked the door open and rushed in. Hualalal. Teams of fully armed golden robes marched through the streets and alleys of King's Landing with murderous intent, marching in neat steps, scaring the people and vendors on the street. Then from time to time, they found a place to kick the door and break in, arresting the sparrows who had participated in the riot. I don't know how many sparrows were caught, lined up and escorted to the prison for trial, and some were killed on the spot. The main gathering place of the sparrows who call themselves Knights of the Holy Sword in King's Landing is of course Flea Bottom. At the same time, this is also the hiding place of the suspected bandit leader Big Sparrow. There are all kinds of people here. Thieves, robbers, rapists, and the poor people at the bottom of King's Landing mostly live here. It is definitely a black hole of public security in King's Landing. The commander of the capital garrison has been troubled by this for a long time and wants to find an opportunity to eradicate these ills with thunder. Therefore, Black Bug personally commanded the capital garrison, mobilized the most troops, and surrounded Flea Bottom from all directions of the street. Ensure that there are no accidents in this battle, and the battle is successful. The leader of the thugs, who is called Big Sparrow, and his followers were arrested, and all the grey forces entrenched in this place were cleared. Then the war of anti-gang operation broke out, and the soldiers of the capital garrison lined up in formation, wearing armor, holding spears in their hands, and marched into Flea Bottom. The large number of sparrows entrenched here wanted to fight back, but they were just like a mantis trying to stop a chariot. They were soon killed, and fled in all directions. However, it was not until then that they realized that there were enemies everywhere, and they could not escape, even if they wanted to. Spare my life. Some people collapsed and knelt down crying and begging for mercy, while others fought back desperately and were killed on the spot. The sparrows died or were captured. However, after a day, the soldiers of the capital garrison completely cleaned up the flea nest, but they did not find the figure of the mob leader Big Sparrow. It seems that the other party was well informed and had escaped from King's Landing one step ahead. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 560 Miracle. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. We failed in our duty and let the leader of the mob, the High Sparrow, escape. In the Red Keep, Black Worm knelt on one knee with a face full of guilt. He promised Viserys that he would clean up these scum, but he didn't expect that the bandit leader would still escape. Of course, perhaps he had heard the news in advance. The High Sparrow had many friends in King's Landing, and someone also secretly funded him. Otherwise the so-called Holy Sword Knights would not have developed so rapidly, beyond common sense, and even gave out rice porridge and meat soup every day. These need to be tracked down slowly. Ramsay also knelt in front of the Iron Throne, with bonfires burning on both sides. He kept knelt and promised Viserys that he would track down the whereabouts of the High Sparrow and pull out all the friends of the High Sparrow in the court. However, the silver-haired young man sat on the cold Iron Throne in a brocade robe, with soft silver gold hair draped over his shoulders. The surrounding firelight illuminated his handsome face in this gloomy palace. Oh. The High Sparrow ran away. His face was calm, as if he had already foreseen that the High Sparrow would escape. After all, the High Sparrow's eloquence had encouraged many poor people to follow him, and these people were his best spies. If there was any slight disturbance in King's Landing, perhaps before Viserys noticed it, the High Sparrow would have known it one step ahead of time. It was not too surprising for Viserys to escape. It's okay. Then the silver-haired young man sitting on the Iron Throne slightly grasped the armrests of the throne. He can't run away. Viserys' pair of lavender eyes suddenly burst into light, like two purple flames burning. Her pictures flashed quickly in his pupils, and time seemed to be flowing backwards quickly, until it was accurately located at a certain moment. High Sparrow. A man in coarse cloth ran to report to the High Sparrow, and the grey-haired old man was shocked when he heard about it. He wanted to notify all the sparrows to leave in advance, but the man stopped him and warned him that if he made any noise in advance and alerted the enemy, he might not be able to escape. The big sparrow heard the man's words, thought for a long time, and finally gritted his teeth and agreed to his plan. Okay. Then the big sparrow greeted all the believers who worshipped him fanatically, as if nothing had happened, and then crawled into a kitchen and never came out again. There was a tunnel under the kitchen that led directly to a house outside the flea nest. The big sparrow crawled out of the tunnel and a carriage was waiting there. Then the big sparrow did not show up outside, but got on the carriage without stopping. They did not go to the city gate, because the city gate would check the carriage, but went to the Fisherman's Square in King's Landing. This is the southernmost gate in King's Landing, Lyngate. It is next to the Blackwater River, and the fishery and aquatic products are well developed. It is also called the Mud Gate among the people of King's Landing. This is the best passage in King's Landing to the outside world. The High Sparrow appeared near the Mud Gate in a carriage. Then he left King's Landing through the smuggling secret passage. At this moment, there was a small wooden boat waiting on the river beach. The High Sparrow boarded the wooden boat again and disappeared completely on the water. Viserys traveled through time and space with the power of the old gods. Although there was no corresponding medium, he relied on the Iron Throne under him as an anchor. Time went back to yesterday, and then he came to the flea bottom in yesterday's time, and found the High Sparrow. The silver-haired young man followed the High Sparrow throughout the whole process, watching how he escaped from King's Landing step by step under the surveillance of Varys' little bird and Ramsay's Ministry of Internal Affairs. This series of wonderful operations by the High Sparrow should not be something that a powerless monk like him could do. Viserys knew that there must be some local forces in King's Landing supporting him behind him. Who could it be? You will know it after checking it out. But Viserys didn't want to go back in time to find the nobles who secretly supported the High Sparrow. These tasks could be handed over to Ramsay to investigate. The most urgent task was to recapture the escaped High Sparrow. The silver-haired young man sitting high on the Iron Throne held the cold armrest with one hand, and a lavender flame flickered in his eyes. And below, in the silent throne room, there was only the crackling sound of the bonfire. The two kneeling on the ground raised their heads to see this scene. They looked at each other with undisguised horror in their eyes. However, at this moment, the lavender flame in Viserys' eyes suddenly disappeared and returned to tranquility. Found you. Then the silver-haired young man held the cold armrest, stood up from the Iron Throne. His voice was calm, and it echoed repeatedly in the empty hall. How then Viserys' figure turned into a black mist in front of Blackbug and Ramsay, and disappeared without a trace. Only the fire in the hall was left slowly burning, and the Iron Throne placed under the three-headed dragon tapestry in the center of the hall was empty. Miracle. This is a miracle. Ramsay, wearing a black cloak, still knelt on the ground below the throne room, but his heart was beating faster and faster, and his gloomy face was full of shock. He didn't expect to see such a horrifying scene with his own eyes. His Majesty really turned into a flowing black mist and disappeared without a trace in front of them. And these seemed to be consistent with some rumors about the king. People rumored that the king mastered a certain kind of terrible magic, so he could make the dragon surrender and not lose in the battle with the Night King. Some coalition soldiers claimed to have seen Viserys riding a dragon, using a certain kind of black magic, repelling the Night King, causing the Night King to be injured, and then forcing the opponent to retreat, winning the war and saving the fate of mankind. On the other side, the commander of the Unsullied Legion, Blackworm, was kneeling on one knee. He was holding a helmet with 3 spikes, one of which was particularly long, symbolizing his identity. Blackworm slowly stood up from the ground holding the helmet. Although he did not say anything, there was also an unconcealable shock in his eyes. The scene in front of him overturned his cognition, and his worldview collapsed. Hey, Blackworm, do you think His Majesty is still a human now? Seeing Blackworm stand up from the ground, Ramsay realized that Viserys had left. He also climbed up from the ground, patted the dust on his body, and then turned around and asked. Of course, Ramsay's words were not insulting Viserys, but he really asked sincerely. He didn't know whether His Majesty was a human or a god now. However, Blackworm just glanced at Ramsay. He didn't like this person very much. He was too cruel. Blackworm's character was straightforward and didn't know how to adapt, so he ignored Ramsay. His footsteps echoed, and he left the throne room holding the helmet. Tap tap. In a manor outside King's Landing, the High Sparrow was wielding a hoe to till the land. A cloud of black mist suddenly appeared behind him, and then transformed into a human figure. Viserys appeared beside him. Are you the High Sparrow? Chapter 561 Attack. Are you the High Sparrow? The High Sparrow, who was swinging a hoe to turn over the soil in the vegetable garden, was slightly startled when he suddenly heard a calm voice coming from behind him. Although he was old, he was not hard of hearing. If someone walked behind him, he should be able to hear it, but the gray-haired old man, wearing a khaki coarse cloth shirt, rolled up his trouser legs and sleeves, and covered in dirt, put down the hoe in his hand and turned around. Behind him stood a young man with silver gold hair, with a calm face and handsome appearance. He was wearing a black velvet brocade robe, gold thread, and a belt inlaid with emeralds. On his chest was a metal dragon head medal, which reflected light slightly in the sun. The silver-haired young man appeared behind the High Sparrow at some point, looking at him calmly, and when the High Sparrow saw the appearance of the person coming, his pupils suddenly shrank, as if he had seen a ghost, and his eyes were full of horror. You are. The moment he saw Viserys, he seemed to have guessed his true identity, but he couldn't figure out how the other party came to him. Since becoming a devout monk, the High Sparrow has devoted himself to the Church of the Seven Gods. He regards serving the gods as his duty and rarely has such violent emotional fluctuations. However, Viserys suddenly appeared behind him, which still made the High Sparrow panic. He was even more panicked than when he knew that the Council of the King's Court decided to use knives to clean up the sparrows in the city. The High Sparrow was old and cunning. He guessed Viserys' identity the moment he saw him. Although he couldn't figure out how he got here, he was silent for a while, and then he spoke in a hoarse voice. The most distinguished guest of the Seven Kingdoms suddenly came to the door, which really caught the old man off guard. Viserys suddenly appeared behind him, and the High Sparrow knew that there was no way to escape, so he simply gave up resistance. There is a small house over there. Your Majesty might as well take a rest and we can have a good talk. The High Sparrow is now hiding in a manor outside King's Landing, because he has no way to leave King's Landing. There are not so many sparrows outside King's Landing willing to listen to his call to jointly resist the Iron Throne. Everyone has land to farm, and is very busy. Moreover, most of the owners of the land are knights and soldiers of the Targaryen family. If the High Sparrow goes there to preach, the land that was collectively granted not long ago may be directly moved back. Compared to my sudden appearance, I'm more surprised that the High Sparrow, who claims to represent the people and serve the masses, actually owns such a vast manor outside the city. After Viserys sat down in the cottage in the manor, he looked around, and his eyes fell on the High Sparrow again and spoke. The High Sparrow's wrinkled cheeks relaxed slightly when he heard Viserys' words. He made a cup of hot tea for the king, and then shook his head. Your Majesty, you don't know. I'm willing to swear to the gods that I have no selfish motives. I took this manor just to better serve the gods and the poor. Your Majesty, the old man with grey hair and wearing khaki coarse cloth said hoarsely. If I don't want to take over the manor, they won't feel at ease. We are the humble peasants who are the ordinary majority. The silver-haired young man sat in the small house of the manor. He did not drink the hot tea that the High Sparrow brewed for him, but asked back with interest. But the High Sparrow just shook his head. He was unwilling to confess the forces and nobles in King's Landing who supported them. I may believe that you really have no selfish motives in taking over this manor. The High Sparrow was unwilling to confess, and Viserys did not force him, because if he didn't say it, it didn't mean that he couldn't find out. It was just a matter of time. After all, the establishment of the new dynasty must be on the corpse of the old dynasty, and Viserys also touched the interests of too many people. It is natural that some people still want to make trouble after kneeling down and surrendering on the surface. However, they can make some small moves, but no one can escape when the final reckoning comes. Viserys will let people pull them out one by one. Viserys' words of approval made the High Sparrow slightly stunned. He thought that for a person as high and mighty as Viserys, it would be impossible to understand that someone would devote himself to others and his own beliefs. "Do you want to believe me?" the grey-haired old man asked back with deep doubt. "Everyone in the world must pursue a purpose when doing things. The purpose you mentioned is one of them. There is nothing incomprehensible about someone pursuing spiritual satisfaction. If everyone in the world only loves money and beauty, wouldn't that world be too monotonous?" Viserys was wearing a black velvet brocade robe. He sat on the chair with his legs crossed. The hot tea in front of him was emitting white smoke. He spoke calmly. He noticed that there were already more than a dozen sparrows holding swords outside the hut approaching, but they were not panicked. Viserys' words made the High Sparrow, who was proficient in debate and eloquent, hesitate a little, and suddenly didn't know how to speak. Could it be that all the things he did were just to satisfy his own spiritual satisfaction? "Your Majesty, I wonder what you think of the gods?" The High Sparrow was briefly confused, but the believers he called on suddenly made a decision for him. "He is the tyrant. Kill him. Overthrow the rule of the Targaryen family." A group of ragged sparrows suddenly rushed in from the door, waving swords and wanting to seize this opportunity to kill Viserys. The High Sparrow was not like Viserys. He was just a mortal with a higher level of ideological awareness. He had not yet realized that these people had approached the surroundings of the hut and attacked the king brazenly. He was immediately shocked and angry. "Stop. Stop." Viserys had once fought against the Night King alone. How could an ordinary person kill him? If you want to deal with him, you must take a long-term plan. The High Sparrow originally wanted to convince people with reason and persuade the kings of the Seven Kingdoms to accept his ideas. However, it was too late for him to stop it now. Viserys sat in place, and the black mist suddenly released from his back and turned into two big hands, pinching the two rioters who were rushing in the front, and then lifted them up high. The big hands formed by the black mist pinched the two people, making them howl in pain. The black mist came with the power of absorbing souls and life, and instantly turned the two people into ashes. Looking for death. The silver-haired young man's lavender eyes flickered slightly, and then looked at the other people. The remaining rioters were stunned for a moment after seeing the scene just now, and they had not yet reacted to what happened. However, at this moment, one of the rioters suddenly seemed to be crazy, waving the axe in his hand, and chopped it directly at his companion next to him, and chopped off the other's head with one axe. The other sparrows around also suddenly began to attack each other. "Sanderson, what are you doing?" Seeing the scene in front of him, the big sparrow was immediately shocked and angry. He didn't know what happened. Why did these devout believers suddenly start to kill each other? Chapter 562 Death of the Great Sparrow. But before the High Sparrow could figure out the reason, a long sword suddenly pierced his heart from behind. A believer who once fanatically supported the High Sparrow had a twisted hatred on his face, just like the look he had just given Viserys, and he was still shouting, "I killed him. I killed him." The manor outside King's Landing was caught in a fight. However, Viserys, who was supposed to be in the fight, had disappeared without a trace. The arrest of the rebels in King's Landing was a mess, and people also heard about this monk who was devout, fair, and honest through rumors. It can be said that he is more worthy of being called a monk than all the monks in the Great Sept of Bela, including the Archbishop, because it is impossible to be worse. The Archbishop today is like a fat pig who can wear clothes and talk, wearing gorgeous robes and a beautiful crystal crown on his head. There are even rumors that the Archbishop often visits a high-end red light venue in King's Landing. He is the most generous customer here. He often enters from the back door, then rents out the entire brothel and drives away other guests, which arouses the dissatisfaction of others. However, although the believers are full of expectations for this noble monk, the big sparrow, they dare not stand up to support him at this time. Because yesterday, the spies of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the soldiers of the capital garrison had just cleaned up the sparrows in King's Landing. killing the city with blood and corpses everywhere. Many people witnessed this scene with their own eyes and even applauded. Now the believers dare to stand up and support the Big Sparrow, which is like lighting a lamp in the toilet and looking for shit. The truly devout believers of the 7 gods can only pray secretly that the Big Sparrow can escape and change the corrupt and decadent style of the church today. However, the believers' prayers did not seem to work, and the 7 gods did not send down the holy light to protect the Big Sparrow. The next day, the news of his death spread throughout King's Landing. The High Sparrow's body was found outside the city in a gorgeous manner, which was very different from the image of the High Sparrow, that he was honest, frugal, and serving the people. Moreover, the High Sparrow died in the so-called internal fighting of the armed forces of the Order, which seemed to have caused the problem of unequal distribution of benefits. But this is just people's speculation. No one knows why they broke out in internal fighting, but the High Sparrow's possession of a gorgeous manner is undeniable. The 7 gods believers who had prayed for him not long ago were disappointed when they heard the news. It turned out that the famous High Sparrow was just the same as those monks and bishops who were just eating and sitting in their positions. They were birds of a feather, but the High Sparrow hid deeper and had a higher talent for performance. The High Sparrow's reputation was so bad that people's disappointment with the church continued to decline. King's Landing is the capital of the 7 kingdoms, and the political situation is ever changing. One must be cautious and tread on thin ice, otherwise one will be crushed to pieces and ruined. If the High Sparrow had not easily set foot in the territory of the Targaryen royal family, he might not have been struck by thunder so quickly. No matter which world or era, the issue of royal succession is never something that can be easily involved. This monkey will be able to seize the opportunity of history to stir up the situation, and become the archbishop will die without a burial place if he makes a mistake. The subsequent storm about this incident in King's Landing has not ended yet. Next, Ramsay will follow the clues and continue to look for the noble friends who have funded the High Sparrow. Open the door. Open the door. Bang, the spies of the Ministry of Internal Affairs set out late at night, like ghosts asking for their lives, breaking open the gates of the gorgeous courtyards in King's Landing, and then waving their hands away their masters. The Ministry of Internal Affairs is doing it. Take them away. Based on the evidence and clues, they caught several dignitaries in King's Landing one after another. Without any formal trial procedures, they were directly imprisoned in the black cell of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. For the Ministry of Internal Affairs, all orders must come from the king, and the king's order is the law. His order to arrest someone is the final judgment of the gods. I don't know how many dignitaries and nobles in King's Landing have been liquidated, and the underground black cell of the Ministry of Internal Affairs is even full. Ramsay Snow also personally interrogated overnight. His interrogation ability has always been the best in the 7 kingdoms, and his ability to torture people is more professional than a baron. The means of skinning are extremely cruel, often not only hurting the body, but also touching the soul, enough to make a person's mental defense collapse in the shortest time. After his torture, these people poked out more people like pouring beans, and even involved a certain overseas free trade city-state. But it was not Bravos. Bravos had become much more cautious after being beaten by Viserys last time. King's Landing set off a bloody storm. On the other side, as the last place in the 7 kingdoms that still raise the banner of resistance to the Iron Throne, the nobles of the Vale united to form a coalition and attacked Gulltown under the leadership of Earlyon Royce, the leader of the Just Alliance. However, the war did not go very smoothly, mainly because the bad news from the 7 kingdoms flew like snowflakes, which greatly affected the morale of the soldiers. The Stormlands fell, Stannis killed his relatives to seize the city, and then was assassinated. The Reach was conquered, the Tyrell family was almost killed, and the Hightower family in Old Town was also destroyed. The Lannister family in the west was killed. This series of bad news all showed that the Targaryen army was unstoppable, quickly destroying all the resistance of the rebels, and countless ancient families were wiped out, leaving only the last Vale unconquered. However, when the nobles of the Vale were fighting in the Eyrie, the Targaryen navy destroyed the navy of the Vale and broke through Gulltown, the largest city in the Vale. The nobles of the Just Alliance then remembered to unite to face the main enemy. However, Gulltown has been under the control of the Targaryen army for a long time, and with the frequent bad news from outside, the morale of the Vale army has been somewhat unstable, and the nobles of the Just Alliance have gradually split. Some nobles advocate surrendering to the Iron Throne, while some advocate negotiations and fighting for rights, and the rest us want to resist and never surrender. The nobles of the Vale have their own ideas, and they argue endlessly without a conclusion. And little Fina Petty Baelish kept running around at this time, continuing to intensify the conflicts between the nobles of the Vale, and guiding the direction of things under his control. Earlyon Royce, the leader of the Just Alliance, was once a staunch opponent of the Iron Throne, but he was also a little shaken under the current situation. He wanted to get in touch with Viserys and sell himself for a good price in exchange for the title of ruler of the Vale. At the same time, he also firmly controlled the old Duke's widow and young son, so that he could more legitimately enter the Eyrie and become the future master of the valley. But there were many people who had the same idea as Yon Royce, except for the deputy commander of the coalition, Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. He really wanted to avenge his brother wholeheartedly without any other thoughts. However, one day, an accident happened. Chapter 563, Conflicts Intensify. The Valley Alliance surrounded Seagull Town. Late one night, in the camp of the Runestone City Army, Lord Yon Royce, the young Duchess of the Eyrie, looked a little tired and haggard, but she still forced a smile. Mainly due to the coercion of her lover, Petty had been instilling in her the idea of obedience, constant power, and the power of love, so that Lyssa Tully gave up thinking, and devoted herself to the beautiful future, described by her lover. In Petty's description, he would become the master of the valley in the future, and Lyssa would marry her love. Even if she was pressed down by other men for pleasure, and even had more perverted ways of playing, and suffered humiliation, Petty promised Lyssa that he would never care. The pain and humiliation Lyssa suffered was only temporary, and the future would surely usher in light, and she would become the real lady of the Eyrie. So Lyssa looked at the Earl of Runestone, who was a little older but still vigorous, and then with tears in her eyes, she took off her clothes and seduced Yon Royce to bed. And Earlyon Royce was indeed not as upright as he appeared to be. He once forced a handsome boy to marry his daughter, who was as strong as his own, because his daughter liked him, and Earlyon also took advantage of this to seize the other party's family foundation, and put it under his control. What's more, he was also one of Lady Lyssa's suitors, and the two had slept together several times, when they were in the Eyrie. Therefore, the Earl of Runestone did not suspect him. On the other side, the night enveloped the camp of the Alliance of the Righteous, and the torches of the servants dispelled the darkness. Think about it again. Lord Brynden Tully, little Fina Petty Baelish, dressed elegantly and politely, stopped in time and spoke. Next to him was Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, with a frown on his face. He didn't like little Fina very much, but he nodded slightly out of basic courtesy. Okay, Lord Petty, I understand. Petty didn't care about the impatient tone of Lord Blackfish, but just smiled slightly. In that case, Lord. Then he nodded politely, and led his servants to leave. Little Fina disappeared into the darkness, and Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, frowned as he watched Petty Baelish go away. He didn't know why he had a bad premonition. He always felt that Petty's words were full of meaning. Brynden Tully didn't like this person, which was obviously obvious. When Petty Baelish was a child, he was fostered in the Tully family as an adopted son. Brynden had seen him many times, and was very friendly to him. At that time, Petty was smart, clever, and knew how to please people. Even Lord Blackfish once regarded him as his junior. However, it was such an adopted son who took away the first blood of a Tully girl, that is, Lyssa Tully, who later married to the Eyrie, and made her pregnant. Even Petty Baelish shamelessly proposed to his brother, wanting to marry Lyssa's sister Catelyn Tully, and claimed that he had also taken Catelyn's virginity. A small adopted son fostered in Riverrun, the son of a small family with no influence on the Five Fingers Peninsula, dared to take the noble Tully sisters? Duke Hoster Tully was naturally furious, and then he drove little Fina out of Riverrun, and later found a man of equal status for his daughter, the Duke of the Vale, Jon Arryn, who did not care about her virginity, but only her status and fertility. At that time, the conflict between Sir Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, and his brother intensified, and he took this opportunity to escort his niece away from Riverrun and rushed to the Vale. He swore allegiance to Jon Arryn and was canonized as a Knight of the Bloody Gate. Brynden Tully loved his niece very much, so he naturally hated this beast in human form who had ruined his niece's little finger. HMPH. Mystifying. Watching Petty Belish's disappearing back, Sir Blackfish snorted coldly, no longer thinking about what the other party had just said, then pressed the hilt of the sword at his waist, turned around and walked into the military camp. The camp of the Vale Army is based on families, and each family is separated from each other, and does not integrate with each other, which is completely different from the unified camp of the Targaryen army. As a Knight of the Bloody Gate, Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, did not have many soldiers under his command, but before Enlil died, he went to Storm's End to borrow thousands of people, so he became an important general in the Vale Army, second only to the commander Jon Royce. However, Sir Blackfish, with the vicissitudes of life and unshaven beard, walked into the camp, but accidentally discovered that there was no light in his niece's tent. "Where's Lyssa? Is she asleep?" Brynden Tully asked with a frown, but he got an unexpected answer from Lyssa's personal maid. "Report to the Lord. Lady Lyssa was picked up by Lord Jon Royce." Huh. Sir Blackfish was slightly stunned. At first, he didn't react to what it meant, but then he understood, and his face was immediately filled with anger. What? When he was in the Eyrie, he heard Lyssa crying and complaining that she had been violated by many nobles of the Vale, including Lord Jon Royce. He occupied Lyssa for the longest time and often took her to his room for several days. At that time, Brynden Tully was furious when he heard his nieces crying. If it wasn't for the overall situation, to unite against the Iron Throne, he almost drew his sword and killed these nobles of the Vale. However, he didn't expect that after such a short time, these nobles of the Vale were ready to move again, targeting his niece and the young master. Damn you. Brynden Tully was shocked and furious after hearing the maid's exaggerated description. He was almost forced to take his niece away while he was out. "Come here." Then Blackfish Brynden Tully gathered his guards and walked towards the Runestone City army aggressively. Although Brynden Tully was furious, he still maintained restraint. He did not bring the army with him, but only some guards, for fear of causing civil unrest. Of course, he did not just believe the maid's one-sided words, but he did not have time to find others to verify it. He had to bring his niece back quickly. Brynden Tully came aggressively, and the camp of the Runestone City army was not far away. The guards saw that it was Sir Blackfish's deputy commander of the army, and of course they did not dare to stop him. "My lord, please stop." Only when they arrived in front of Jon Royce's tent did his personal guards bite the bullet and try to stop him. "Get out of here." But the guard was pushed away by the furious Brynden Tully. Chapter 564, Civil War in the Valley. Then he broke into the tent of the Earl of Runestone City. Then he saw the strong and vigorous Earl Jon Royce riding naked on his niece Lyssa Tully. Lyssa's clothes were torn to pieces and her eyes were red. It was obvious that she had just cried. "Damn old dog." Brynden Tully's eyes turned red when he saw this scene. He could no longer bear the emotions he had just restrained. He immediately drew his sword with a clang. Earl Jon Royce also did not expect Brynden Tully to suddenly come at this time and break into his tent directly. In fact, Lyssa Tully was not robbed by him, but she came here by herself. Earl Jon was certainly not so stupid to rob Lady Lyssa at this time. And Lady Lyssa expressed her intention to find an adoptive father for her son Robert Arryn. After thinking about it, she finally felt that Lord Jon Royce was the most trustworthy. As the leader of the Justice Alliance, Jon Royce controls the most powerful army in the valley. Naturally, he has no doubts about Lyssa Tully's choice and words. He is Lyssa's best choice. He really thought that Lyssa chose him, so he fell into the honey trap. The two of them rolled onto the bed. But he didn't expect Brynden Tully to suddenly rush over at this critical moment, which almost scared Jon Royce. He hurriedly wanted to explain. "Lord Brynden Tully, this is a misunderstanding." He felt that he had encountered a honey trap. However, Brynden Tully, who was furious, repeatedly restrained his emotions, but how could he bear it when he saw the scene in front of him? Puff! Sir Blackfish immediately pierced the heart of the Earl of Runestone City with a sword, and blood gushed out in an instant. "You." Early on Royce took off his clothes. Without his bronze armor with magic spells, he naturally couldn't stop Brynden Tully's sword. His eyes widened, as if he had not expected the other party to really dare to kill him. "It's you." Then, before he died, he seemed to have finally figured out something, and turned his head with difficulty. With a pair of eyes that were about to burst, he looked at Lady Lisa, who had just been panting under him. He just wanted to say something, but the blood gushed out and quickly blocked his trachea. Even if he wanted to say something, he couldn't say it. Then the heavy corpse with chest hair lost all his strength, and fell heavily on the bed with a thump. And Brynden Tully, who drew his sword, and killed people in anger, seemed to calm down, when the long sword pierced the heart of the Earl of Runestone City. "Damn it." He cursed fiercely in a low voice, but it was too late. The other party had already died in his hands. He held the bloody long sword, and looked at the fat and strong body of Jon Royce, and finally he could only grit his teeth. "Lissa, quick, put on your clothes." He hurriedly asked his niece to put on her clothes, then turned around, and called on all the brothers to fight with him. "Brothers, let's fight together." After all, although it was the camp of the Veil Coalition, it was indeed the garrison of the Runestone City army, and there were enemies all around. And he also killed the commander of the Veil army. Even though he was the deputy commander, and was in the right, who could he go to explain to at this moment? Now he could only fight his way out of the blood, reunite with the soldiers of the headquarters, and then make plans to summon all the nobles of the Veil to explain this matter. Brynden Tully's brain was spinning rapidly, and his thoughts were very thorough. The woman on the bed didn't care about the body lying beside her. The blood was still gurgling out. Her eyes were wide open, as if she was unwilling to close her eyes. She was still staring at her. Lissa Tully hurriedly found a piece of clothing, and put it on to cover her body temporarily. However, this was the camp of the Runestone City army. They had naturally attracted the attention of the soldiers by breaking into the Earl's tent. In particular, there was an unusual noise in the tent, so the Runestone City soldiers quickly surrounded them. "What's going on? What happened?" The Runestone City soldiers surrounded the tent, and the soldiers brought by Brynden Tully were also nervous, and drew their swords. "Stop." Their number was much smaller than the other side, and this was the Runestone City camp, and the other side's people were still pouring in. "Father, what are you doing here? Let me go in and see my father." However, at this moment, Andrew Royce, the eldest son of Earl Jon Royce, the heir of Runestone City, also rushed over. He saw so many people gathered in front of his father's tent, and he was a little anxious, thinking that something had happened to his father. But he did not doubt that it was Brynden Tully who did it. After all, although Sir Blackfish and his father did not have a good relationship, there was no conflict, not to mention that he was now in the army. "Get out of the way. Get out of the way." Andrew Royce, the eldest son of Runestone City, pushed the soldiers away without any defense, and rushed into the tent. Then he saw Brynden Tully holding a bloody sword, Lady Lissa who was half-dressed, and his father's ugly naked body lying on the bed. Andrew Royce was slightly startled. He didn't react to what happened at first, but then he understood it. His face was full of shock and anger, and he drew the sword from his waist. "Brynden Tully, you killed my father?" The situation in the tent was very clear. His father died from a sword in the chest, and only Brynden Tully was in the tent holding a bloody sword. Seeing this, Andrew Royce drew his sword, and wanted to duel with Brynden Tully to avenge his father. However, one of the soldiers brought by Sir Blackfish was quick-witted and quick-handed. After all, he had been discovered now, and it was naturally impossible to conceal it. It was better to catch him off guard. "Go to hell." Puff, the Stormland soldier, holding a long sword, chopped off Andrew Royce's head from behind when Andrew Royce just drew his sword to duel with Brynden Tully. Gilulu, the eldest son of Runestone City, was caught off guard, and his head immediately rolled to the ground, and blood spurted directly to the top of the tent like a fountain. Lady Lissa had never seen such a cruel killing scene before, and she was immediately frightened and pale, and screamed. And all this happened too quickly, like lightning and flint. Brynden Tully killed early on Royce, and then his soldiers chopped and killed the heir of Runestone City. The Runestone City soldiers outside saw their masters walk in, and then heard a roar, and then the head was chopped off and thrown out, and they immediately exploded. Revenge for the Earl. The soldiers of the Royce family began to besiege the tent, and the Stormland soldiers brought by Brynden Tully fought back. His military camp was not far from here, and someone went back to inform them, so naturally more Stormland soldiers came over together, unable to sit by and watch their fellow countrymen being bullied. Kill. There was chaos in the valley camp, with shouts of killing everywhere. Chapter 565. The mantis catches the cicada, waiting for the yellow bag behind. Clang, the long swords collided violently. Go to hell. Brynden Tully's voice was hoarse and his face was weathered. He seized the opportunity and chopped down a Royce soldier who rushed over with a sword. Puff, then he staggered and pierced the chest of an enemy. Blood spurted out, and his grey hair was stained with the splattered blood. Hoo-hoo, Sir Blackfish gasped heavily. Although he had superb swordsmanship and fought bravely, he was outnumbered after all. The soldiers around him had fallen one after another, and the battle situation became precarious. The second son of the Royce family, Sir Robert Royce, stood up at this time, took over the baton of his father and brother, and commanded the army to besiege the camp to avenge his father. Kill. The shouts of killing shook the sky in the camp. However, at this critical moment, outside the battlefield of the turmoil in the valley camp, the heavy rumbling sound of iron hooves suddenly sounded. Rumbled the cavalry galloped, trampling on the land. Countless knights of the Vale formed an array, led by little Fina Petty-Beelish, holding their spears high, and rushed to the battlefield. It turned out that little Fina had already secretly persuaded several nobles to defect to the Targaryen family. After all, the general situation is now determined. The Targaryen army has swept all the land, except the north and the Vale. Now it is a dead end to resist. Although the Vale has high mountains and steep mountains, wonders and steep landscapes, these cannot stop the dragons from flying over their heads at will, and even shit on their heads. The geographical conditions of the Westerlands are similar to those of the Vale, and are also very complicated, but they still succumbed to the dragon's flames. The Lannister family was almost wiped out, and even the people with golden hair and green eyes in Lannisport were almost killed. Although the nobles of the Vale did not want to lose the power in their hands, they did not want to lose the heads on their necks, including the lives of their entire families. Therefore, some nobles showed their desire to surrender, but they encountered opposition from the nobles who advocated war, and little Fina persuaded this group of people to stand on his side. He confessed his identity to these nobles who surrendered, saying that he was a secret envoy of the Iron Throne, and had secretly surrendered to the new king in Pentos 2 years ago. As long as these people obeyed his orders, they would be forgiven by the Iron Throne and their past would be forgiven. Therefore, Petty-Beelish first appointed his loveless Tully to provoke the conflict between the two giants in the Vale army, one of whom was the powerful Earl of Runestone City, Jon Royce, and the other was the Knight of the Bloody Gate, Brynden Tully. The two of them killed each other, and both suffered losses, and Petty-Beelish's army entered the field, and easily swept away these people, seizing the power of the Vale in one fell swoop, proving his strength to His Majesty the King, and indirectly claiming the authority of the Vale. This is little Fina's ultimate plan. However, now, Brynden Tully and the Royce family really fought each other, and the two sides killed each other, and the blood flowed like a river. Little Fina led the army to come, and the mantis stalked the cicada, while the Oriole was behind, destroying the troops of both sides like a crushing blow. Knights of the Vale, listen to my orders. Petty-Beelish was well dressed, wearing a black cloak fluttering in the wind. He pinned his cloak with a metal mockingbird pin, which was the Beelish family emblem he changed himself. He thought the mockingbird was more suitable for his identity. He wore deerskin gloves on his hands. Then he took off his gloves, and put them on the saddle, raised his hand, and pointed straight ahead, and spoke loudly. For the Iron Throne, quell this rebellion. The Knights of the Vale cheered when they heard his order, and then the iron hooves rumbled down. Kill. Boom boom, the sound of horses galloping, the war horses neighing, the screams of soldiers one after another, and the sound of metal cutting into flesh and blood. On the battlefield, neither side expected that a third party would intervene. What's going on? Sir Rob Royce, the second son of Runestone City, was riding on his warhorse, and saw the Vale Knights with various banners pouring into the battlefield like a steel torrent, and slaughtering indiscriminately. He was immediately shocked. It's Lord Petty-Beelish. The sharp-eyed guard saw Petty-Beelish surrounded by stars in the center. Little Fina? Why can he command so many Veil troops? However, at this time, no one could explain to Robert Royce what happened, and while Littlefinger won the support of most nobles quietly, the civil war situation had taken a sharp turn for the worse after the Veil Knights intervened. The soldiers of the Royce family had suffered heavy casualties, and were on the verge of defeat. My lord, run away. With the loyal guards urging him, Robert Royce could only grit his teeth, take a last look in the direction of Littlefinger, and then, under the protection of the guards, spurred his horse to flee the battlefield, heading towards his hometown, Runestone City. While Robert Royce abandoned the battlefield and fled, Brynden Tully on the other side was also in a bad situation. He was surrounded in the center by the Runestone City army, and when the Veil Knights broke in, he had been wounded several times, and was about to fall. Lord Brynden. When Littlefinger Petty Baelish saw that Brynden Tully did not die in the war, a trace of regret flashed across his grey-green eyes, but no one noticed it. He immediately threw the reins, and jumped off the horse, and hurried over to support Brynden Tully. I'm here with my troops to rescue you. After all, Littlefinger had once been fostered in Reveron. If it weren't for what happened later, Littlefinger was expelled from Reveron, and he would have called Brynden his uncle. Therefore, his claim that he was here to rescue Sir Blackfish naturally did not arouse any suspicion. The soldiers loyal to Brynden Tully looked at each other. Although they had just been killed and wounded by the Knights of the Veil, they still laid down their weapons at this time. After all, the Knights of the Veil had already controlled the situation. They were outnumbered, and meaningless resistance would only lead to death. Petty Brynden was wounded several times, and gasped for air. His right hand was still tightly holding the long sword, as if in a stress response, and the other hand was holding Petty Baelish's palm. At this moment, he thought of the time in Reveron. At that time, he was very friendly to all the children of the Tully family, including Petty. He advocated family unity, but in the end, something like that happened. Now that Petty was able to put aside the past and lead his troops to rescue him, Brynden Tully felt a little warm in his heart. Chapter 566 Arrival. Petty. However, at this moment, Lady Lyssa, who had been hiding in the tent and thus escaped, was wearing a loose robe that was obviously for men. She ran out of the tent barefoot, disheveled, crying and snotting. Then she hugged Petty Baelish, even knocking her seriously injured uncle to the ground. Petty, you are finally here. I thought you didn't want me anymore. Lady Lyssa cried with tears in her eyes, both sad and excited. Petty came too late, obviously later than the time they agreed. She even thought that Petty didn't want her anymore, just treated her as a dispensable pawn, and wanted her to die here with her uncle. But Petty finally came over, and Lady Lyssa's doubts and sadness were swept away immediately. She was naturally excited when she thought of a happy life in the future. Lyssa. However, Petty held the trembling woman in his arms, and a trace of disgust was barely noticeable in his eyes. He originally wanted to appear in an upright identity, but the first two words of Lyssa, a woman as stupid as a pig, exposed Littlefinger's despicable calculations. Now he could almost feel the suspicious eyes behind him. Okay, Lyssa, stop talking. My silly woman. But he still did not show this deep disgust, but gently stroked the woman's back, like a considerate husband, whispering and comforting. Then Petty stood up, his black cloak fluttering in the wind, and looked at the servants behind him. This is not the place to stay. Take Lady Lyssa away, and protect the safety of the lady and Lord Robert Arryn. Yes, my lord. The fully armed servants of the Veil quickly agreed, walked up and helped Lady Lyssa away from the chaotic battlefield. Petty turned around, and did not meet Brynden Tully's eyes, that seemed to be able to spit fire. The two words his good niece Lyssa said just now, after running out, exposed Petty's conspiracy. Petty and Lyssa had planned it long ago. He instructed his niece to provoke infighting among the nobles of the Vale, and even provoke the conflict between him and early on Royce, and finally killed the other party with his own hands. The Vale army was defeated, and then he, Petty Baelish, jumped out to clean up the mess, and took all the power of the Vale in his hands. However, even though Brynden Tully saw the true face of Littlefinger, his feelings just now turned into anger, but he was useless now. There were nobles and soldiers of the Vale who had surrendered to Petty everywhere, and he was also seriously injured. It would be useless to reveal the true face of Littlefinger now, and there was no way to kill him personally, so he could only give up his life in vain. Although Brendan Tully was a bit stubborn, he was not a fool, and knew when to swallow his anger. Lord Tully was seriously injured. "Where is Mr. Sermon? Ask Mr. Sermon to come over." Petty Beelish did not look at the angry eyes of Sir Blackfish, but urged his men to find Mr. Sermon. Mr. Sermon was a Meester of the Eyrie. He was young, thin, and had sparse hair. Lord Jonarin had always treated Mr. Sermon as his son. But now Mr. Sermon had been bribed and persuaded by Petty Beelish, because he was loyal to the Arryn family and only obeyed the orders of Lady Lyssa, and Lady Lyssa listened to Petty, so he had become Littlefinger's man a long time ago. Then the army was cleaning up the battlefield in a mess, and Mr. Sermon was hurriedly called over. "My lord." Littlefinger turned his back to Brendan Tully, and gave him a look, telling Mr. Common that Sir Blackfish was his elder, and that he should take good care of him. Mr. Common understood and agreed. Then the guards carried the injured Sir Brendan Tully down to treat his injuries, and the situation on the battlefield was completely under control. The nobles of the Vale who were unwilling to surrender were captured alive, and the Vale Knights led by Petty completely took control of the power. However, at this moment, a roar of a giant dragon suddenly came from the top of the Vale Coalition army, and it spread far away like thunder. "What's that sound?" The Vale Knights on the ground were slightly disturbed, and they all raised their heads, put their hands on the awning, and looked in the direction of the sound in the dazzling sunlight. Littlefinger, who was well dressed, wearing a black cloak and a bird-sounding brooch, was slightly startled when he heard the voice behind him and stopped. Then he turned around, and like the other soldiers, raised his hand to slightly block the dazzling sunlight above his head, and looked at the sky behind him. "This is..." Petty Beelish had a neatly trimmed beard on his chin, which looked very elegant. His dark hair was mixed with a little grey. He saw something in the sky behind him, and his grey-green eyes suddenly narrowed, and his 5 fingers clenched tightly. He saw a figure with wings spread out, and appeared at the end of the distant sky. It was flying in this direction, and became bigger and bigger in the sight of countless people. Dragon. Roar. Balerian's roar resounded throughout the world. The huge black dragon covered the sky and the sun. The huge wings spread out, and swept up the wind, and the fallen leaves and dust on the ground flew up. The Vale soldiers below suddenly became chaotic. Some of them had participated in the war against the White Walkers, including the later Age of Fire, so it was not the first time they saw a dragon. However, most of them saw a dragon for the first time, so they were naturally panicked. Dragon. Dragon. Run. Some people panicked, and prepared to throw away their weapons and escape into the mountains to hide, even forgetting that they had already surrendered to the Iron Throne, and killed those companions who were unwilling to surrender. However, Balerian seemed to know that they had surrendered, and did not launch an attack. It fell from the sky and roared again, when it landed on the ground. Littlefinger, the actual controller of the Vale army, reacted very quickly. He saw Balerian falling from the sky, and the rolling airwaves that fell to the ground directly hit his cheek, making him a little dusty. But he saw that there was still a person sitting on the dragon's back, and he immediately lifted his robe, and knelt on one knee without any hesitation. "Your Majesty, welcome to your loyal Vale." Petty Beelish suddenly knelt on one knee, and the many nobles and knights of the Vale behind him reacted instantly when they saw this scene. Crash. Everyone hurriedly jumped off their horses, and then the armor made a friction sound, and they all knelt on one knee. "Welcome, Your Majesty." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 567. Governor of the Valley. Viserys rode on the dragon's back, looking at the knights of the valley kneeling down below, with a calm expression on his face. Because he saw this scene in advance, he knew that Littlefinger's strategy of driving the tiger to devour the wolf was successful, so he rushed here from King's Landing. Petty Beelish. Littlefinger, who was kneeling at the front of the crowd, heard Viserys' voice, and his muscles under the black cloak suddenly tensed, as if he was a little nervous. "Your Majesty." because all his efforts and dedication were for this day, to grow from a person who was contemptuously called Littlefinger to the real Lord Petty Beelish. He still couldn't forget the shocked and contemptuous look of Duke Hoster when he proposed to Catelyn. Even the face of the red-haired girl, the goddess that Petty thought about day and night, was full of disbelief. Who is qualified to marry the Tully family? Catelyn's first fiancé was Brandon Stark, the heir to Winterfell at the time and Eddard's elder brother. After Brandon was burned to death by the Mad King for standing up for his sister, he married his younger brother Eddard, who later became the Duke of Winterfell. Littlefinger never entered Catelyn's field of vision from beginning to end. There was no other reason, but the identities of the two were very different. So in a sense, Littlefinger's struggle history is quite inspiring. He has excellent abilities. He has really grown up step by step from a little bug that no one noticed, and has become a big man that people who looked down on him in the past have to look up to. However, this moment is the turning point of his life. Petty Beelish knelt on one knee in front of the dragon. When he heard Viserys' voice, his heart suddenly rose, and his breathing was even slightly hurried. "You have fulfilled your promise to me." Then he heard a light voice coming from above his head. "The veil is yours." Petty Beelish breathed a sigh of relief as his beating heart suddenly fell from the clouds to the ground. It was only then that he realized that he had shed so much cold sweat without realizing it. His brain was even a little dizzy, and the ground, that his 5 fingers were tightly holding, was squeezed into a ball. Then Littlefinger took a deep breath, restrained his excitement, and then knelt on both knees instead of one knee, and kowtowed heavily on the ground. "Thank you, Your Majesty." The kingdom and the Vale were finally peacefully unified. From then on, all the 7 kingdoms, except the North, were included in the rule of the Iron Throne, and there was no open resistance. As a little known fact, Petty Beelish was the first governor of the kingdom to be appointed. This may be a little unexpected. Those who followed Viserys to conquer the world have not been canonized at this moment, because there are no confidants in the Vale army. Unlike conquering other places, the Targaryen army did not attack the Vale, but only captured Gulltown by sea. The Vale surrendered by itself, so Viserys needed a capable and trustworthy person to help him manage the Vale temporarily. And people like Littlefinger and Euron Greyjoy are essentially the same. They are indeed capable. If the king is strong, they will be good babies. If they are weak, they will do small tricks. If you use people, you don't doubt them. Viserys dares to use them, and is not afraid of them causing trouble. They themselves are like a mirror in their hearts. The new King Viserys rode a dragon to the Vale, and all the soldiers in the Vale knelt and surrendered. The leader was the future governor of the Vale, Petty Beelish. This scene was recorded on the spot by a nobleman in the army, who was good at painting, and even became a famous painting passed down to later generations. Now Viserys has verbally granted Petty the power of the Vale, but Littlefinger doesn't know the specific details of the enthronement yet. He needs to wait until the national policy and laws of the new dynasty are determined, and the messenger from King's Landing reads them out. The Vale army besieging Gulltown outside the city kneeled down and surrendered, and the Targaryen army in Gulltown also opened the gate. They also saw the scene of the dragon falling from the sky, knowing that the matter had been resolved, and the Vale knelt down and submitted to the Iron Throne. After all, the scene of the dragon's arrival cannot be faked, and many Targaryen soldiers on the city walls have witnessed it with their own eyes. In fact, they also saw the civil strife in the Vale camp not long ago, but the old General Joffrey Bracken used his troops cautiously, fearing an ambush, and did not easily send troops to interfere in the civil war in the Vale. Then he waited until the dragon descended before opening the city gate. "Your Majesty." The sound of horse hooves rang out, and the old general with white hair and beard rode a war horse from Gulltown, came to Viserys, and then turned over and dismounted. "Congratulations, Your Majesty, on regaining the Vale." Looking at the calm silver-haired young man in front of him, Joffrey Bracken was filled with emotion. He really watched Viserys grow up step by step. From the first time he mustered up the courage to express his opinion, and it was adopted. By chance, the Dragonstone fleet escaped the largest storm surge in history, and destroyed the usurper fleet that had just been launched. At that time, Joffrey Bracken looked at this boy with new eyes. Later, at the age of 8, he visited Bravos alone, signed a secret agreement, and got a piece of land to recuperate. Viserys grew up step by step. Needless to say, he overcame many terrible difficulties along the way, and finally successfully regained the Iron Throne, and aspired to rule the Seven Kingdoms, defeating all enemies. Lord Joffrey has worked hard too. And Viserys looked at the old man in front of him, and his eyes became much softer. He did not ask the guards to help, but personally helped Lord Joffrey Bracken to turn over and get off the horse. The old general has made great contributions to Viserys' success today. Joffrey Bracken must be one of the top dignitaries in the Seven Kingdoms. He was the eldest son of the Bracken family in Stonehenge. However, by mistake, he killed the patriarch of the Blackwood family in the street in King's Landing. He was hunted by King Jaehaerys II at the time, and fled to the continent of Essos. Viserys once asked Earl Joffrey Bracken, as the capital of the Riverlands, he wanted the twins or Stonehenge. The once prosperous free family and the twins has died in the war. Some of their descendants fled to the continent of Essos, and dared not return to Westeros. Now the twins is in ruins and full of traces of war. Bandits are rampant and urgently need to be cleaned up. The twins separates the north and the south. As a river crossing, its geographical location is extremely important and has great development potential. Stonehenge is his hometown, where he grew up. After careful consideration, Joffrey Bracken decided to choose the twins. Stonehenge was left to his niece, Barbara, the eldest daughter of Janos Bracken, the former Earl of Stonehenge. When the war was over, he led his servants to the twins to take over the castle. Your Majesty. While Joffrey Bracken was chatting with Viserys, his son Henry Bracken also rode over. The young brown-haired boy looked high-spirited, then turned over and dismounted to greet His Majesty the King. Henry was originally the illegitimate son of the old general, but with Viserys' permission, he obtained the surname of the Bracken family. Becoming the heir of the Bracken family of the twins, his fate changed dramatically. Chapter 568, Resurrection. Everyone has different experiences in life. Henry was originally just a bastard of humble status, and he had an uncle with ulterior motives who wanted to send him to the battlefield, to die at any time. However, he did not expect that his fate would change drastically one day, and his father, who had been missing for many years, suddenly appeared again. He became a king's minister, and held great power, and his status became important all of a sudden. Various dignitaries rushed to see him, even including the former Prime Minister Jon Arryn, etc. Henry is still a little dizzy now. Afterwards, Viserys did not stay in Gull Town for a long time, and returned with the army, but set off to fly to the Eyrie first. The news of the surrender of the Vale army has not yet come, but the soldiers of the Arryn family in the Eyrie seem to have been ready to face the dragon. Over the past year, they have been exhausted by various wars, including the coalition forces of the League of the Righteous. As soon as Balerion appeared in the Eyrie, the soldiers of the Arryn family opened the city gates and surrendered. War is like this. It will be difficult at the beginning, but it will become smoother and smoother in the later stages. In the early stages of the war, the Targaryen army encountered stubborn resistance, such as the army of the Westerlands in the Battle of Bronzegate in the Stormlands. However, in the later stages, the armies of many places surrendered when they saw the three-headed dragon flag and no longer resisted. Viserys descended on the Eyrie and surrendered this beautiful and magnificent castle. A few days later, the Vale coalition retreated. Lyn Corbray, the heir of Shinjuku City, held the Valyrian steel weapon lady of the MT and volunteered to lead troops to attack Runestone City under Petty Baelish's account, claiming to kill the last rebels and not stop until he took the head of Robert Royce. When the Vale army retreated, it also brought bad news. The Bloody Gate Knight Blackfish Brynden Tully was seriously injured and dying. Maester Common had been trying to rescue him, but the effect was not very good. He was dying and about to take his last breath. However, the Vale army retreated to the Gates of the Moon, and Brynden Tully was also taken back to the Eyrie. Viserys, who was staying here temporarily, heard the news and took the initiative to visit the famous Southern Marshal in the future. Then he found that Brynden Tully was not seriously injured and dying, but was poisoned, and then used the Black Mist to help him strengthen his body and dispel the medicinal properties of the poison. He had used this method to save people several times, and this time he did not fail. In the sunroom of the Eyrie, the hall was full of people. Petty Baelish, the first governor of the Vale, who temporarily entered the Eyrie in the name of a false father, was dressed in gorgeous clothes, wearing a black cloak and a mockingbird medal on his chest. His face was full of grief, standing in the middle of the crowd at the back. Petty Beelish captured the veil for Viserys without bloodshed, and in return Viserys gave him the power of the veil, and conferred him the title of the first governor of the veil in the history of the new dynasty. However, Viserys left a pit for Littlefinger, that is, he did not give Littlefinger the Eyrie. Today, Lord Petty Beelish is nominally the governor of the Vale, holding great power, but he does not have his own castle. His castle is still on the Five Fingers Peninsula, with only an abandoned stone tower. A lord of the Vale who does not even have his own castle? No, from now on, there is no concept of a lord. All nobles have only one lord, that is, the king on the Iron Throne. However, it is indeed too ridiculous for a governor who holds great power in the Vale to not have his own castle. Therefore, Petter also realized this problem after Viserys left. He had to hurriedly make an engagement with Lysa Tully and enter the Eyrie as the husband of Lady Lysa and the fake father of the owner of the Eyrie. However, his identity is not very safe. After all, he is just a rootless duckweed. Littlefinger sits in the position of governor of the Vale, which looks glamorous on the surface, but in fact he still needs to be trembling and treading on thin ice. Petty Beelish was naturally a smart man. He was amazed at the king's methods. After being beaten with carrots and sticks, he understood his situation and knew that he needed to be more cautious in the future and be loyal to the king. He remembered it deeply in his heart. The woman beside him, Lysa Tully, not only got her fiancé's arm as she wished, but also looked at her dying uncle with a sad face. Although Lysa Tully was a cruel woman who could give everything for love, her sadness at this moment was the most real in the whole hall. The Tully family has also encountered turmoil in recent years. Women marry far away, and their natal families are their best backing. However, the Tully family declined, and their titles were stripped. Their father was killed, and only Reveron was retained. If her uncle left again, Lady Lysa would really be helpless. At this moment, there was silence in the hall. A silver-haired young man in a brocade robe stood at the front, with his hand on Brynden Tully's forehead. Others could not see the black mist pouring into the body of Sir Blackfish, but could only see that his body began to tremble slightly. Petty Beelish, the governor of the Vale, stood at the front of the crowd and watched Viserys' actions, his eyes slightly fixed. He suddenly had a bad premonition. "What is your majesty doing?" The other nobles of the Vale looked at each other and could not help whispering, wondering what Viserys was doing. However, at this moment, the body of Blackfish Brynden Tully suddenly trembled violently, and then he suddenly lay on the edge of the bed and spit out a mouthful of black blood. Puff. Viserys seemed to have predicted that he would wake up and left his side one step ahead so as not to be splashed by the black blood. Brynden Tully, whose hair was a little grey, vomited blood and then coughed violently as if he was going to cough out all his internal organs. He felt a warm current quickly passing through his whole body, penetrating into his flesh and bones, strengthening his body. The body that was originally filled with pain and toxins was quickly dispelled, like darkness encountering light, and finally swept away. Although his violent coughing sounded a bit uncomfortable, the nobles of the valley in the hall were in an uproar. Because he just looked like he was dying of serious injuries, and even his breathing had begun to decline. It seemed that he was about to take his last breath. Everyone gathered here because the king wanted to visit him, and another reason was to see off the Bloodgate night. But they never expected to see a scene of resurrection. Chapter 569. Life-saving grace. The seriously injured and dying Blackfish Brynden Tully was recovering at a speed visible to the naked eye. After spitting out a mouthful of obviously unusual black blood, he sat up completely, and his spirit was completely different from before. It was like a last gaze before death, but these nobles had never seen a dying person's last gaze jump off the bed and jump up and down. On the other side, the expression on the face of Mr. Common of the Eyrie was full of shock. This? Impossible. He opened his mouth slightly, pursed his dry lips, and then suddenly realized that something was wrong, and then hurriedly found an excuse to sneak out and left the hall. In the hall, Littlefinger Petty Beelish and his fiancée Lysa Tully saw Brynden Tully come back to life, and their expressions were completely different. Petty's expression was slightly shocked. His 5 fingers clenched, and his fingernails pinched a mark on the palm of his hand, while Lisa Tully cried with joy. Great. Petty, look. Uncle has been saved by His Majesty. Lisa excitedly grabbed her fiance's arm, not noticing Petty Belish's slightly ugly face. What should we do? However, Littlefinger was a man who had seen big scenes after all. His brain was working rapidly, thinking about how to deal with the current situation. Although he wanted to turn around and run away like Mr. Common, he finally calmed down, restrained the ugly expression on his face, and also showed a touch of joy, then nodded and said, "Yes, Lisa, we have to thank His Majesty for saving my uncle's life. Look. This is the power of the king. He is born extraordinary." Then Littlefinger looked at the many nobles of the valley around him and spoke loudly. "Our king has led us through the most difficult times. In the future, we will surely overcome more difficulties." Petty Belish took the lead in flattering, and the nobles of the valley who chose to surrender were also shrewd people, so they all seized the opportunity to speak. For a time, flattery was everywhere, and the whole hall was filled with messy voices. But Viserys, who was standing in the middle of the sunroom of the Eyrie, had a calm face, quietly looking at Brynden Tully, who was sitting on the bed. His face was still a little pale. Sir Blackfish sat on the bed and seemed to have not come back to his senses. He just stared at the floor blankly. Although he fainted several times during this period, he clearly knew the changes in his body. He knew that he was poisoned. His injuries should not have worsened so severely, but he couldn't open his mouth and couldn't speak. Even if he could speak, he couldn't reach other people and couldn't spread it. He had already despaired and thought he was dead, but he didn't expect to be saved by someone under such circumstances. This is a magical power, like being reborn. Then Brynden Tully suppressed his excitement and raised his head to look at Viserys. He had seen Viserys before. The two had joined hands to fight against the White Walkers. However, Viserys was riding on the back of a dragon, so he was not very noticeable on the ground. Later, the two of them faced off on the battlefield of the Civil War. The result was the same. The silver-haired dragon rider was too dazzling. One man and one dragon resisted thousands of troops. The coalition army was full of generals, and Sir Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, was not very conspicuous among them. Therefore, Brynden Tully recognized Viserys, but Viserys did not recognize him. "Your Majesty." The general with grey hair looked at Viserys with a complicated look. It stands to reason that his brother Hoster Tully died in the Civil War, and he should avenge his brother. In fact, he also made many efforts to resist Viserys, but he did not expect that he would be saved by the other party in the end. However, Sir Blackfish did not struggle. He was a person with a clear distinction between love and hate, and his life-saving grace was no less than that of a reborn parent. Then he rolled over and got off the bed, then supported himself with one hand and knelt on one knee in front of Viserys. "Your Majesty saved my life, and I will die for it." Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, swore allegiance to Viserys, and Viserys accepted his allegiance, gaining an experienced general, and helped him up from the ground. Lisa Tully ran over with tears in her eyes to hug her uncle, and Brynden Tully did not refuse. His eyes were always on Petty Belish, the Littlefinger who walked with him, and looked calm on the surface. But in the end, he did not say what was on his lips, and chose to swallow it back into his stomach. The matter in the Vale was finally settled, and there was no voice of resistance to the Iron Throne in the Seven Kingdoms. However, after Viserys used a little trick in the Vale to shock people, he boarded the dragon and flew to the Riverlands. The people who stayed in the Vale also dispersed, and the nobles of the Vale also disbanded their armies and returned to their homes. The nobles who participated in the rebellion and were killed received the due punishment, and their castles were taken away and rewarded to the meritorious soldiers. The largest city in the Vale, Gulltown, is temporarily under the jurisdiction of the Dragonstone fleet. The Grayson family in Gulltown had been eliminated by Elyon Royce before the war broke out. The Justice Alliance was very crazy at the beginning of the war. Any opposition voices would be eliminated. They broke through several castles and destroyed several families before they took control of the power of the Vale, leaving only one voice. Now the Dragonstone Navy did not evacuate Gulltown, but stationed here. Although the nobles of the Vale were jealous of Gulltown, they dared not say a word. His Majesty the King stayed in Gulltown, Old Town, and Lana sport for other purposes. In addition to the nobles of the Vale, the rest of the people also dispersed. Brynden Tully swore allegiance to Viserys, lifted his oath to the Arryn family, and automatically gave up the position of Knight of the Bloody Gate. In fact, Littlefinger entered the Eyrie as a fake father. The rift between the two was here. Brynden Tully did not expose it in public, but there was no room for reasoning between the two. The future was bound to be hostile, and his niece Lysa Tully also broke the heart of Sir Blackfish. Although Lysa apologized to her uncle again and again, it was impossible to win back Brynden's heart. Viserys asked Brynden to go to King's Landing to wait for appointment. He had outstanding abilities and rich experience in commanding operations, and he would have great development in the army in the future. Brynden Tully left the Eyrie and set off for King's Landing. On the other side, Joffrey Bracken and his son took 200 soldiers with them, and set off for the twins. Chapter 570 Greywater. The twins, in the future, will be the governor of the Three Rivers, the capital of the Riverlands, and the territory of the Bracken family of the twins. Viserys had already communicated with the old general that the governor of the Three Rivers must be him. Therefore, Joffrey Bracken and his son Henry came to inspect the situation of the twins first, the specific degree of damage to the castle, and the amount of money needed to repair it. Viserys told him that, if he had no money, he could advance it from the treasury. The Targaryen army raided the warehouse of the Tyrell family in Highgarden, and seized millions of gold dragons. Now Viserys is in Daedric. In the future, when the kingdom's army goes north to the northern border, it will inevitably use the twins as an important transportation hub to transport supplies. And anyway, once the twins is rebuilt, the source of money will roll in, and it will be more than enough to repay this interest-free loan. The geographical location of the twins is extremely important, and Viserys is also very relieved to hand him over to someone to manage. His next stop is also the north, but Balerian's flying speed is definitely much faster than Earl Joffrey and his people. The next goal after the unification of the country is naturally to recover the land and fight against the common enemy of all mankind. Viserys certainly did not forget Melisandre's warning. 5 years later, the White Walkers will make a comeback. This time, he took the opportunity to recover the Vale to leave King's Landing and tour the north to see what the neck looks like now. He did not stop. When he came here last time he went beyond the wall. Viserys set off in the morning and flew to the twins in the afternoon. There are still traces of the wall left here, but he did not stay here, but flew directly to the neck. Ho! The roar of the dragon resounded through the world, penetrating the fog over the neck, and it was unknown how many creatures still alive in the marshland were startled, and then it fell from the sky. After crossing the twins and arriving at the neck, Viserys actually clearly felt that the temperature around him was dropping suddenly. How the breath he exhaled turned into white mist, and some fine snowflakes gradually floated in the air. His eyes burned with purple flames, and it was obvious that the power of the god of cold had not yet receded. Thousands of black lines lingered on this piece of land, forming a black hole. The further north you went, the closer you were to the center of the black hole, and you couldn't even look directly at it. When Viserys absorbed the power of the old gods and his moon nature reached 39, he no longer needed Melisandre to sacrifice herself, blend, and use the power of the red god to peek into the realm of the gods. He was only one step away from breaking through that mysterious realm, and his current state was at the peak below it, but this last step made him feel like he had crossed the sky. The last step was more difficult than the sum of the previous ones, full of dangerous aura, and even made people unable to help but be daunted. However, the more this happened, the more Viserys looked forward to this last step. He really wanted to know what kind of state he would be in after taking the last step. He seemed to have encountered a bottleneck now, and the black mist he normally absorbed could no longer be improved, and he no longer had to kill people to absorb the black fog. King's Landing was the most densely populated city in the Seven Kingdoms. A large number of people died naturally every day, and their souls would be absorbed. God, or demigod, if the three-eyed raven and the Night King were considered demigods in this world, then Viserys seemed to be on par with them. And going one step further would be every time he thought of this, his silent heart would be heated again. The influence of absorbing the old gods still existed more or less, and Viserys' character became a little indifferent. But his own mental strength was strong enough, and he did not fall into the state of becoming a machine. he still maintained his own characteristics and resisted the erosion of the power of the old gods. However, because of this, he had long ago changed his main goal from unifying the 7 kingdoms to a more difficult option. Unifying the 7 kingdoms was indeed not difficult for him. Viserys rode a black dragon and landed on the causeway of the neck. There were still traces of the explosion here. People were busy with the civil war and naturally had no time to repair the causeway. This is a big project. Without a large investment from the state and the use of labor, it would be difficult for a family to repair it successfully. After all, the coalition forces used the entire King's Landing wildfire reserve. Russell. Viserys walked alone on the neck swamp causeway in the cold wind, with a thin layer of snow under his feet and plants that had long been dead all around him. The terrifying swamp giant lizards and poisonous creatures in the past had died in this catastrophe. He squatted down and touched the ground under him, looking at the traces left by the explosion in front of him, feeling a lot of emotion. Then he rode the dragon and left the causeway, continuing to search in the next swamp, hoping to find some valuable clues. However, he accidentally saw a lonely castle in the depths of the frozen swamp. It was wrapped in branches and vines and pressed with a layer of white snow. It looked particularly hidden and integrated into the endless swamp. There is a castle in the next swamp? Viserys saw this hidden castle from the sky and was slightly stunned, but then he thought of what this castle was. The leader of the Marshlanders, the Reed family of Greywater Watch. It is built on a floating island in the swamp. Even ravens cannot find the exact location. Greywater Watch has no maesters, no knights, and no weapon masters. Throughout history, the Andals, the Ironborn, the Free Family, and all other armies that have tried to conquer Greywater Watch have not been able to find it. However, Viserys did not expect to accidentally discover this lost castle while flying over the neck. Viserys was still quite curious about this castle. Without the specific coordinates, he could not find the location of Greywater Watch, even if he traveled through time. However, if he found its exact location, everything would become much simpler. Then Viserys ordered Balerion to land outside the castle. This place was indeed as the legend recorded, built on a floating island inside the neck, but it seemed to be integrated with the swamp, so it was extremely hidden. Fortunately, the area of this floating island was not too small, enough to accommodate the arrival of the dragon. After Viserys jumped off the dragon's back, he looked up at this inconspicuous small castle hidden in the swamp. Its brick and stone surface was covered with vines and mosses, completely wrapped in it. There was no tower, only a main castle, and no outer walls. It seemed that it did not need to defend against any external enemies. The swamps and poisonous miasma outside were its best walls. Then Viserys pushed the door and walked into the castle. Chapter 571 Holland Reed. Scattered snowflakes flew down, the roof of Greywater Castle had collapsed, and a thick layer of snow had accumulated on the ground. There was a rustling sound under his feet, and Viserys pushed open the dilapidated door and walked into this abandoned castle. There was no sudden attack by the Whites this time. Obviously, after losing the power of the Night King, even the Whites could not pass through the muddy swamp. However, the silver-haired young man just walked in 2 steps, looked around, and stopped slightly. Because in a very conspicuous place in the castle, there was obviously a trace of vitality. Green vines grew, growing green leaves, wrapped around something, and seemed to be shaking slightly. If you look closely, it's as if a person is hanging on the beam. This is impossible. Viserys frowned slightly when he saw this scene. He had walked in the neck swamp for so long without seeing any vitality. However, he didn't expect that there would be such obvious vitality here, as if it was early spring. Then he walked closer, pulled apart the vines, and found that there was indeed a corpse wrapped in it, shaking slightly, and it looked like it had been dead for a long time. The silver-haired young man thought for a while, and then he thought of a story. When the human coalition hoped to use the neck swamp to stop the White Walkers from advancing, the people of the swamp also made great efforts, but unfortunately they failed in the end. Some of the people of the swamp fled their hometown, and most of them died here, including the leader of the swamp, the mysterious head of the Reed family, Howland Reed. According to legend, he hanged himself in his castle, and no one knew why he did it. But now more than a year has passed. If this person is really Howland Reed, there is no reason for him to still hang on the rope. He should have fallen down with the breaking of the rope or the decay of the flesh. Did he defeat gravity? Viserys frowned slightly, and his palm involuntarily grasped the hilt of the sword, but now for him, as an existence below the gods, it seems that nothing can threaten him. The silver-haired young man walked up to the body that was swaying slightly in the wind and looked up. It can be seen that the body was not very tall and had typical characteristics of a marshalander. His face was pale and bloodless, and there was a light layer of frost on his cheeks. His eyes were wide open, and the grey and dry eyes made people shudder. However, Viserys was not afraid. He stretched out his hand and was about to touch it, wanting to trace back the past of this strange corpse. But just before the silver-haired young man's hand was about to touch the body, his eyes suddenly flashed slightly, as if he saw something, and then he quickly withdrew his hand. Boom. At this moment, the beam above Viserys' head seemed to finally be unable to bear the weight and collapsed instantly. And the body hanging on the beam also fell to the ground, like a broken sandbag, and fell heavily to the ground with a dull sound and a somewhat painful groan. Damn it. The corpse was rubbing his buttocks, with a bitter look on his face, but the frost on his face had not melted yet, and his face was also bloodless. Combined with this gloomy and dilapidated old castle, the scene seemed a bit weird and terrifying. However, Viserys' eyes were slightly fixed, but he did not retreat. Because in his eyes, he was sure that the other party had indeed transformed from a corpse into a living person, not a so-called ghost. His body temperature was steadily rising, and finally gradually reached the temperature that a normal person should have. The frost on his face was also melting, turning into snow water and flowing down, and at the same time, his pale face gradually regained its blood color and rosy. He sat on the ground and rubbed his buttocks, then raised his head and looked at Viserys, then climbed up from the ground in a somewhat embarrassed manner and said, "I hope I didn't scare you, my friend." However, he immediately noticed Viserys' long silver gold hair and violet eyes that were not covered up, and the expression on his face was slightly stunned. Viserys didn't care about the obvious recognition on the other's face. He frowned and looked at the short man in front of him. Because with his knowledge, it was difficult to explain what had just happened. Why would a corpse suddenly come back to life? What kind of magic is this? Are you the commander of the Cranny Men, Howland Reed? Viserys asked in a cold voice. Howland Reed's expression was obviously a little nervous, because he really recognized who he was. Through the open gate of the castle, you can see a huge black dragon lying outside the door, and the man in front of him has very obvious Targaryen family features, with extraordinary beauty, silver gold long hair, and violet purple eyes. Who else in the world has a Targaryen family member with a black dragon? But this is not the same as he expected. Howland Reed was roaring in his heart, but on the surface he seemed very cramped. He opened his mouth to hide his identity, but in the end, he thought about it, and reason told him that he shouldn't do this. Then the short man from the marshland had no choice but to nod. "I am." However, before he finished speaking, he saw the calm silver-haired young man in front of him suddenly reach out and grab his shoulder. Howland Reed was slightly startled. He instinctively wanted to dodge, but he found that the other party's palm seemed to be able to navigate, and he couldn't dodge it. Then he was grabbed by the shoulder. "You." The short man from the marshland was shocked and was about to say something, but the next second, the world in front of them had suddenly changed. Time was reversing rapidly, and the dilapidated castle around was gradually restored to its pre-dismantled appearance. The dim candlelight burned slowly, and a letter for help with words written on it was placed on the table, signed by Eddard Stark, the Duke of Winterfell. There was also a slender girl with long brown hair and a thin boy with dark green eyes in the castle. He was very young, but his face was calm and serious, as if he had seen through many things in the world. The man who had just spoken to Viserys and was brought back to life was also in the castle. He knelt down in front of a shield with a smiling heart tree emblem and prayed silently. "I saw it." However, at this moment, the thin boy with dark green eyes who was being pulled by his sister suddenly spoke. The man who was kneeling in front of the smiling tree shield suddenly trembled and then turned his head. "What did you see, Jojen?" Then, when the boy finished talking about what he saw, Howland Reed fell into silence. After a while, He waved his hand and drove the brother and sister away. Chapter 572. The Magic of the Swamp People. After his eldest daughter Mira Reed and his youngest son Jojen Reed left, Howland Reed kowtowed to the Laughing Tree Shield again in the dim candlelight, and prayed silently for a long time. Then he stood up, read the letter for help from the Duke of Winterfell again, put it down, found a pen and paper in the drawer, sat at the table and thought for a moment, and wrote a few lines. Russell the castle in the swamp was silent, without any sound. Howland Reed sat at the table alone, writing something, as if he was writing a letter. After finishing writing, he carefully folded the letter paper, put it in the envelope, and threw it on the table. Then he found a rope, moved a bench, put the rope on the beam, and then stepped on the bench, and put his neck on it. The next morning, a scream broke the silence in Greywater View. Mira, the eldest daughter of Howland Reed, came to find him for something, but found that his father had already hanged on the beam. Many short-statured people of the marshland came, including Howland Reed's son Jojen. However, Jojen was as calm as many of the people around him. He seemed to have foreseen this result long ago, and he didn't even shed a tear, while his sister Mira cried like a tearful person. After his father committed suicide, Mira and Jojen found the envelope left by his father on the desk. After opening it, they saw the contents left on it. Then the young siblings called on the rest of the tribe to leave the neck and migrate to the south, claiming that humans could not resist the invasion of the White Walkers. However, some people listened to the opinions of Mira and her brother, and more people of the marshland chose to stay here because they couldn't leave their homeland and help the coalition forces repel the White Walkers. All the time flashed by Viserys' eyes one by one, as if he had stepped on the accelerator, and Howland Reed himself stood beside Viserys, looking at himself in the picture tremblingly. Even a year ago, Howland Reed couldn't help but glance at the corner of the room before he hanged himself. He always felt a little uneasy, as if he was aware of the passers-by in history, just like Brynden Rivers in front of the gods would. They are all people with innate spiritual power that is different from ordinary people, so they are extremely sensitive to the changes in the details around them. After personally experiencing a time travel, when he returned to the present again, Howland Reed looked at Viserys with a different look, full of shock and astonishment. He couldn't figure out what happened during his sleep. Could it be that the White Walkers had destroyed the world and killed the Heart Tree? Did the Dragon Rider of the Targaryen family become the last lonely traveler in the world? He couldn't sense the existence of the Heart Tree, but he sensed the power of the Heart Tree from Viserys. Why are you hanging? However, after seeing the whole story, Viserys frowned slightly, was silent for a moment, then turned around and asked, "This is about the magic of the Marshlanders, Your Majesty. We are praying to the Heart Tree." Howland Reed restrained his nervous expression, and then explained very cautiously. The Marshlanders are one of the oldest and most traditional races in Westeros, and many legends about them are still preserved in the outside world. The most common of them is that they master ancient black magic, have frog-like palms, prey on fish, frogs, and lizards, and are good at hiding and sneak attacks. If you fight in the swamp, even thousands of troops cannot defeat the Marshlanders. The Marshlanders and the Children of the Forest are close partners. We once resisted invasion together and believed in the Heart Tree. For the Marshlanders, just like the Children of the Forest, there is no distinction between new and old gods. The new and old gods are just artificial distinctions. The Marshlanders and the Children of the Forest both believe in the Heart Tree, and the Fishbeam Wood as the source of their power and magic. When my son Jojen was younger, he had grey water fever, a fatal disease, but the Green Seer saved him and gave him the green sight. Howland Reed was explaining that in the past, his son Jojen once said, he saw it. He saw the endless swamps freeze and condense a layer of frost, and the White Walkers finally crossed the neck with green flames under their feet. Therefore, Howland Reed left a letter asking all the tribesmen to abandon their homes and flee the neck, but he didn't expect that most of the tribesmen didn't listen to him after he hanged. At that time, I prayed to the Heart Tree, hoping that it would bless the tribesmen to get through the difficulties smoothly, and I would turn into a Fishbeam Wood. This is a very fair deal. Many children of the forest will choose to turn into a Fishbeam Wood before they die. Howland Reed said as he looked down at the vines under his feet. They had lost their vitality after being pulled down by Viserys. But it's obvious Then the short man in the swamp raised his head, looked at the dilapidated environment around him, and shrugged his shoulders. My prayer failed. The weirwood did not answer my prayer and protect my people. Likewise, I did not turn into a tree. You prayed to the heart tree. Viserys was slightly stunned when he heard this. He absorbed the power of the old gods, but never knew it had this ability. And although he could see the past, who knew what Howland Reed was mumbling while kneeling on the ground? That's right. I was once humiliated by several knights squires at the tourney of Harrenhal. Well, it was the tourney you all know. I was short, and they bullied me so much that I didn't dare to fight back. Lady Lyanna Stark helped me drive away the squires. Benjen suggested that I should be given a sword and a shield so that I could win my own dignity. I accepted his proposal and prayed to the weirwood all night, asking it to give me strength. Then I took the patchwork armor and this shield, defeated those knights, and won my own dignity. Howland Reed looked at the laughing tree shield on the table not far away, with a bit of nostalgia in his eyes. It was a rare highlight in his life. Viserys was stunned again when he heard it, and then blinked. He saw the whole picture of the tourney, the face under the laughing tree knight, and then retracted his gaze the next second. I thought it was Lyanna who stood up for you? No, of course I won the dignity for myself. The brothers of the Stark family saw that I had become strong, so they kept silent to the outside world. But now I can no longer detect the existence of the heart tree. After a moment of silence, Howland Reed raised his head slightly and spoke again. You are not an old god, nor a green prophet. Chapter 573 The Power of Faith. The power of the old gods is closely related to the number of people who believe in them, and the number of weirwoods. Howland Reed then invited Viserys to sit on the ground, and the two talked on the ground. Viserys did not mind the dirtiness, and sat on the ground to talk with the commander of the Marshlanders. He told more secrets of the weirwood. He naturally knew that Viserys had the power of the old gods in his body. The Marshlanders seemed to be no less sensitive to the power of the old gods than the children of the forest. They were also one of the oldest races in Westeros, and lived in this swamp from birth. Howland Reed believed that the weakening of the power of the old gods was related to the decreasing number of people who believed in weirwoods on the entire continent. In addition, the large-scale felling of weirwoods also affected the use of the power of the old gods, and even crossing the narrow sea became extremely difficult, let alone affecting the entire world. In the past, the children of the forest could pray to the weirwoods and cast terrifying magic to chop off Dawn's arm and prevent the ancestors from crossing the sea, but now it might be difficult to kill a person. According to Howland Reed's analysis, he came up with a view that was completely opposite to that of the children of the forest. He believed that Viserys' current existence should not belong to the old gods or the green seers, but to be between them, an ordinary person who has mastered the power of the old gods. Of course, Howland Reed looked at Viserys again, and perhaps he was not ordinary either. The expression of the great commander of the Marshlanders was a little tangled, because he prayed to the heart tree, but could no longer perceive the existence of the heart tree, but the person in front of him did have the power of the old gods. Then the two had a long talk, and Howland Reed asked Viserys about the changes in the world today. When he learned that humans finally defeated the White Walkers and the Targaryen army swept across the Six Kingdoms to unify the entire territory, he was still a little incredible. Because when he hanged, the king above his head was still Robert Baratheon, but now Robert Baratheon is in prison. Then he asked where his two children were now, but Viserys just shook his head slightly. He had never paid attention to where Mira Reed and Jojen Reed, the brother and sister, had gone, and he had never even seen each other. But they probably didn't die in the coalition. After all, they were just children. Even if the coalition was crazy, they would not let the two children go to the battlefield. Maybe they were with their own people. Then Viserys humbly asked him a few questions about the old gods, the green prophets, and the children of the forest. Viserys was quite interested in what Howland Reed said, that the power of the old gods came from the fishbeamwood and the number of people who believed in him. Because he had fallen into a bottleneck, the way forward was blocked, and he could only choose to continue to improve other attributes, and he actually deliberately carried out some tests on how to take the last step. For example, he used to hide the existence of the black mist, but now he deliberately reveals it on certain occasions. showing his holiness in front of people, such as the throne room of the Red Keep, the Eyrie and the Vale, etc. The legendary story of the king mastering magic to fight against the White Walkers has gradually spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms, and this is not just a legend, but more people have seen it with their own eyes. With so many nobles' evidence, and the Red God's believers' unremitting efforts to promote the Son of Destiny, the people at the bottom are more convinced that the king above their heads is really the one who carries a destiny. What exactly is the power of faith? It is still difficult for Viserys to explain it at present. After all, he is just a toddler and has just come into contact with this level. However, through the dialogue with this mysterious leader of the Swamplanders, Viserys seems to have some understanding of the gods of this world. They seem to need the power of faith very much, but they cannot easily interfere with the human world. Perhaps only when they receive prayers or pay a great price can they bring down a little bit of revelation. Maybe this is a reason why the ancestors cut down a large number of fish beams, but the old gods were indifferent. The silver-haired young man sat on the ground and speculated secretly. However, if this is true, in a sense, humans actually have a great deal of initiative in the face of the gods. Especially the kings of humans, because they can decide what their countries and countless subjects believe in. Is this also the reason why the Lord of Light took the initiative to contact him? However, even though Viserys himself is quite powerful, stronger than most people in this world, he is still a beginner in some areas, even extremely insignificant, and must work hard to keep up. Apart from anything else, he will actually die if someone in this world wants to kill him, except the gods themselves, perhaps after a series of means, such as burying him deep in the land several kilometers below, or throwing him into the endless sea, with no place to stay around. He can still be killed. Of course, all this is based on the fact that he was captured alive and lost his consciousness, and Balerion had to leave his side. Then how do you want to punish him? Then Howland Reed mentioned his old friend Eddard Stark. He wanted to plead for Eddard, but he didn't know how to open his mouth. After all, the other party had once launched a war against the Iron Throne, but there was indeed a reason for it, because Viserys' father, the Mad King, had first burned the other party's father and brother to death. Do you want to plead for Eddard? Viserys was in a complicated state of mind, still thinking about what had just happened, and then he raised his head and spoke. Howland Reed nodded cautiously. He is a good man. There are many good people in this world. The silver-haired young man shook his head slightly. He is my good friend. The Lord Commander of the Marshlanders then hurriedly added, and Viserys looked at his cheek seriously, nodded, and told him the truth. Eddard may have a chance to survive. Of course it depends on how he chooses. The sun set, and the sky outside was gradually darkening. Viserys was about to say goodbye and leave. He asked Howland Reed if he needed to give him a ride and take him away from the Neck, but the Lord Commander of the Marshlanders shook his head and refused him. The Neck is extremely dangerous to outsiders, but it is like home to the people of the marshlands. When the people of the marshlands return to their home, they naturally don't need to be given a ride. And since he has come back to life and has not turned into a fishbeam tree, he still has some things to do in Greywater. He told Viserys that he would rush to King's Landing before the trial, participate in the ceremony on behalf of the people of the marshlands, swear allegiance to the king, and find his 2 children. By the way, if you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 574 Blood Troop. This trip was very fruitful. After that, Viserys said goodbye to the commander of the Marshlanders, boarded the dragon, and set off to return to King's Landing. Balerion looked down at Howland Reed. The dragon was extremely sensitive to the existence of magic. It could sense that this mysterious little being had some skills. Then it let out a low and powerful roar. Boom. The dragon's thick and powerful hind legs suddenly kicked the ground, and its huge wings whistled, raising a rolling wave of air, tearing through the wind and snow, and rushing into the sky, leaving the floating island hidden in the swamp of Greywater. The commander of the Marshlanders on the ground stood in front of the castle and watched Viserys leave. He was blown into a dusty face, choked on a few mouthfuls of wind, snow, and mud, and kept coughing. In fact, the journey from the neck to King's Landing is a long way, although Balerion can fly back in one breath. After all, he has been flying all day. The dragon is not made of iron and needs proper rest, hunting and eating. Unfortunately, the neck was deserted, even the plants were dead, not to mention the blood food that could satisfy the dragon's appetite. And Viserys didn't need to rush back to King's Landing so early. He had nothing to do when he returned to King's Landing. Instead, he might as well stroll around in the vast world to enjoy his solitude and relax. Perhaps he was not qualified as a king, because no good king would not like to stay in his own palace, but would run around alone when he had nothing to do. Therefore, when the dragon flew away from the neck, the sky was already dark and the surrounding air gradually warmed up a lot. The neck was like a dividing line between cold and warm. South of the neck was warm summer, while north of the neck was still shrouded in winter. Viserys decided to rest in the Twins for a night and set off again the next day. He was hesitating between going to Casterly Rock tomorrow and going home. Rhaenys and the Targaryen army escorted Tywin Lannister back home. All the golden-haired people in Casterly Rock and Lannisport were almost killed. There was no one familiar with him, so there was no point in him going there. Then the dragon let out a roar like thunder, and the huge figure swooped down from the sky through the clouds. However, on the ground, a group of Brotherhood members with strange clothes and fierce faces occupied the abandoned Twins. They lit torches to dispel the darkness, and under the banner of a black goat, there were about 100 people, including old, young, fat, and short. They looked different and their hair colors did not seem to be from the same region or the same race, and they were not good people. Dragon. Damn it. It's a dragon. Run. However, when these mercenaries, who looked more ferocious than their elder brothers, saw Balerion falling from the sky, they were like frightened little lambs, and their faces were immediately pale, spewing out obscenities with a surprising amount of mother. Fuck. Shit. We just robbed a few villages, and kidnapped a few bastards. Is it worth sending a dragon to catch us? They were frightened, and then fled in a panic, thinking that the dragon swooping down from their heads was targeting them. They didn't even have time to take away the gold dragons and various gold, silver and jewelry that they had earned from their hard work during this period, and turned around and fled into the woods outside the city. And Viserys also saw the frightened members of the Brotherhood below. He was very sorry for scaring these little cuties, but he was just stopping by to rest, and naturally he would not mobilize a large army for a few small thieves. However, Viserys was not happy with the things left behind by these petty thieves. Among them were severed limbs and human heads that rolled on the ground, emitting a foul smell. There was also a large group of captives, who showed expressions of fear and numbness. It seemed that these petty thieves preferred to torture their prey. However, they were tied up and imprisoned in the former stable in the Twins. They could not escape when they saw the dragon coming. However, although Viserys was young, as an experienced commander who had experienced many wars, he was naturally immune to the broken limbs and human heads on the ground. The battlefield was much bloodier than this. Any veteran who had been on the battlefield would not be scared by such a scene. Therefore, the silver-haired young man frowned slightly, and then Balerion understood. The dragon roared, raised its head high, and then a mouthful of dragon flame poured down. The surging dragon flames burned all the filth and the tents and daily necessities left by the Brotherhood into ashes, purifying the surrounding air and making it less smelly. The dragon suddenly spit out dragon flames, and the victims imprisoned in the stable suddenly showed fear on their faces, as if they thought of some bad memories, and howled in fear, and all shrank into the corner of the stable. Except for a girl with a grey face and short black hair, her palms were off, and it seemed that she often held knives and other weapons. She stood up, and a strong light of hope appeared in her eyes. Dragon. He is. Her hands and feet were tied tightly with the thickest iron chains, and there were fresh and mottled blood on her body. It seemed that she had just been captured not long ago, and the members of the Brotherhood were on high alert. Is he Viserys? In the woods in the distance, the members of the Brotherhood were lying in the woods and whispering. One of them asked, and the other answered. How many dragons are there in the world? This black dragon should be Balerion, and its master must be Viserys. The word king is a word that is high above them, and very far away from them. For this group of vicious criminals and exiles, they should have nothing to do with the king in their lifetime. However, they didn't expect to accidentally bump into the king passing by while camping today. The other party came riding a dragon, and just accidentally passing by scared them like frightened rabbits, hiding in the woods in embarrassment. It's so fucking majestic. A mercenary said what others were thinking unwillingly, which resonated with them. Compared with this one, I can't even feel jealous. Because people will only feel jealous when the gap is not so big. But when the gap between people is so big, there is not even jealousy, but only a strong sense of awe. They were just like loaches and rats in the gutter. They wouldn't even notice if someone accidentally stepped on them to death. They might even dislike their shoes being dirty. Why is he not sitting on his iron throne and being his king? The tall, thin-goateed leader of the Brotherhood said angrily. They came from Essos and wanted to take advantage of the chaos in the Seven Kingdoms to make a fortune. However, the reality was that the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms really had no time to care about them. The thieves also made a lot of money, but all their gains were in the twins, and they became nothing in one day. What do you think? If we kidnapped the kings of the Seven Kingdoms, how much ransom could we extort? Then the leader named Varghoth seemed to have suddenly thought of something and spoke, his eyes flashing with madness and eagerness. Chapter 575 Rescue the Villagers. The words of the leader of the warriors, Varghoth, shocked everyone present. Of course, they actually have another unpleasant name, called the Blood Troop. They come from the continent of Essos and are notorious. Their main members are criminals and exiles from all over the world. They are called this name because of their cruel behavior and strange costumes. However, the current leader, a tall, thin, goateed and slurred Koha man, said his bold idea, which still made all the criminals present look at each other in surprise. You want to attack the leader of the human army? A somewhat hunchbacked, gray-haired Meester narrowed his eyes. His attitude was very cautious. He felt that Varghoth's idea was too crazy. You know, according to rumors, Viserys was able to fight against the leader of the White Walkers, although none of them had seen it. But the monkette who liked to abuse children and the crazy clown Shagwell and others in the team were eager to try. They were crazy by nature, fearless, and best at taking risks. The scene described by Varghoth made them tremble with excitement. How crazy is it to kidnap a king? And how much ransom can be extorted? Looking at the companions around him who were gradually showing excitement, the old Meester who wanted to speak out to stop them at first couldn't help but shut his mouth. He had no choice but to associate with madmen and demons. Others seemed to think he was such a person, but he thought he was rational. However, even though they came up with crazy ideas and wanted to kidnap the king, they had to face a problem that could not be ignored. There was a terrifying dragon between them. They had to wait until the dragon left Viserys before they could act, otherwise everything would be in vain. Their rushing forward would only add a dinner for the dragon. The villains of the Blood Troop hid in the woods outside the twins, concealing their figures, trying to wait until the dragon left to attack Viserys. They thought they would have to wait for a long time, but it seemed that the gods favored them. They didn't have to wait too long. The terrifying dragon, whose size was big enough to block out the sun, let out a low roar, and then flapped its wings, and flew high into the sky under the bright moonlight, as if it was going out to look for food. Only Viserys and the villagers they had captured were left in the ruined twins. In the twins, a handsome silver-haired young man sat in a clean place and lit a bonfire. The fire brought warmth and dispelled the darkness. He could go without food for a long time, but Balerion couldn't. The dragon needed to eat a lot of food a day. Now that he was not in King's Landing, Balerion needed to find food for himself, so Viserys sent it out to play. Then he untied the villagers who were imprisoned in the stable, cut his ropes one by one with a sword, and let them out. Some of these villagers were already missing arms and legs, covered with scars, and even dying. There were some women who were also victims in the room of this abandoned castle. They were all wives or daughters of these villagers. However, war is a game for the rich and powerful, and a disaster for the common people. The ants under the general trend will be easily destroyed. When Viserys used his sword to cut the ropes on these people, the girl whose hands and feet were tied with iron chains beside him had her eyes widened. She had never seen such a sharp sword. Then when Viserys walked in front of her, the girl with a slender figure and long legs took the initiative. to stretch out her hands. "Thank you." Her voice was a little hoarse, not as pleasant as other girls. There were some calluses on her palms and knuckles, which looked like the marks left by holding a knife for many years, which was completely opposite to the smile on her face. Viserys looked at her, especially at the calluses on her hands, and then the dusk in his hand fell without any hesitation, and the hard ropes that bound the girl broke with a clang. Then the silver-haired young man cut off the girl's shackles with another sword and completely released her. The girl looked about the same age as Viserys, less than 20 years old, full of youth and vitality, but her face was a little dirty at the moment, which seemed to be related to her disguise, and there were mottled blood stains on her body from the fight. She moved her hands and feet, then picked up her own scimitar and dagger from the kitchen on the other side, and put them behind her, then turned her head, and looked at the silver-haired young man who continued to release people. "Are you Viserys, the king of the Seven Kingdoms?" Unlike the other rescued villagers knelt on the ground and kowtowed to Viserys to thank him, and then with Viserys' permission, they picked up a few gold dragons or silver deer from the ground, and then hurriedly fled from here. But the girl wearing grey-black tattered leather armor and blood on her body did not leave, but followed Viserys and asked. Her words made more villagers who were picking up gold coins on the ground shudder, and they looked up at Viserys with more awe in their eyes. Although they had just seen the dragon, and had already guessed so, the word king was as far away from the peasants as the villains of the bloody troop. Viserys did not answer the other party. He cut the rope that tied the last villager, and the other villager knelt on the ground and kowtowed to him. "Thank you, your majesty." Then he ran over and hurried to pick up the scattered golden dragons on the ground. Some of them had melted under Balerian's dragon flame just now and solidified on the ground. However, they did not despise them. They knelt on the ground to pull them out of the ground and put them into their pockets. "Take some money and leave quickly, otherwise you won't be able to leave in a while." Viserys looked at their greedy looks and then reminded them. "Okay, thank you, your majesty." Viserys suddenly spoke and frightened the rescued villagers to stop their actions. Although they were still greedy and wanted to find more treasures left by the robbers, they did not dare to pick up gold coins anymore. "This is the king's order." Viserys stood in front of the campfire holding a blood-red sword. His silver gold long hair reflected light slightly. He had an upright figure and a decent face. He really had the appearance of a lord. He had been king for more than 10 years and had the bearing of a king. His words were unquestionable. The villagers restrained their greed, thanked Viserys once again, and left. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.